Sovereign Ambition: The Life and Two Presidencies of Donald J. Trump. The following is a chronological exploration of one of the most improbable and consequential figures in American history. From the gold-leafed boardrooms of Manhattan to a historic restoration of power as the 47th president, this is the story of a man who consistently refused to accept the word no from the establishment. Over the coming chapters, we will trace 80 years of ambition. The foundations, from the construction sites of Queens and the rigors of the New York Military Academy to the lecture halls of Wharton. The architect, the high-stakes deals that built the Grand Hyatt and Trump Tower, transforming a local developer into a global brand. The media phenomenon, the cultural revolution of The Apprentice, which redefined a legacy for a new generation. The 45th Presidency, an era of tax reform, a historic reshaping of the Supreme Court, and a fundamental shift in American foreign policy. The Exile and Return, a definitive account of the years 2021 through 2024, navigating unprecedented legal challenges and an assassination attempt toward a historic, non-consecutive second term. The 47th Presidency, early analysis of the return to the Oval Office, including the Department of Government Efficiency, and high-stakes military decisions in the 250th year of the Republic. Prepare for a journey through the heart of American power and the enduring resilience of a leader who changed the course of the 21st century. Chapter 1: The Foundations of the Dynasty, 1946 to 1970. The borough of Queens, New York, in the summer of 1946 is a place of extraordinary energy. The war is over. The boys have come home. And across the 5 boroughs of New York City, a great exhale is moving through the streets, a collective sigh of relief that is already transforming itself almost overnight into something louder, something hungrier: ambition. It is into this world, this particular American moment, that Donald John Trump arrives on the 14th of June, 1946. He is born at Jamaica Hospital, in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, the 4th of 5 children born to Frederick Christ Trump and his wife Mary Ann. The date itself carries a quiet significance that no one in that delivery room could possibly appreciate. Flag Day, the birthday of the United States Army. A day that, in the American calendar, belongs to symbols of nationhood and strength. In the years to come, the man born on this day will attach enormous meaning to such coincidences. The house at 85-15 Midland Parkway, in the Jamaica Estates neighborhood of Queens, is not a modest house. It never was. Fred Trump, Donald's father, has already established himself as one of the most productive homebuilders in the outer boroughs of New York, and the family residence, a 23-room Georgian colonial mansion, stands as a testament to what a determined man can build from almost nothing. It has a maid's quarters, a chauffeur, a circular driveway. In Jamaica Estates, the neighbors are prosperous, the lawns are wide, and the distances between houses suggest a kind of deliberate separation from the crowded, churning city just beyond the tree line. Fred Trump is, by any measure, a formidable presence. He is not a warm man in the conventional sense, not a man who traffics in sentiment or lingers over long conversations at the dinner table. He is a builder. He is a deal maker. He wakes before dawn, visits his construction sites before the workers have finished their coffee, and measures success in the most concrete terms imaginable: land acquired, units built, rent collected. He has clawed his way upward through the Great Depression, through wartime housing contracts, through political connections and relentless work. And he has arrived at a very particular philosophy of life, one that he will spend years transmitting to his children, and most particularly to Donald, who seems from early on to absorb it most deeply. Mary Ann Trump is a different kind of force. Born in the Scottish village of Tong on the Isle of Lewis in 1912, she has come to America as a young woman of 18, arriving in New York with a modest sum of money and an iron constitution. She is elegant, she is socially conscious, and she possesses a theatrical streak, a love of pageantry and ceremony that her husband does not share. She watches the Queen's coronation on the family's new television set and is visibly moved. She dresses well, she carries herself with dignity, and she instills in her children a sense that presentation matters, that how you appear to the world is not a trivial concern but a statement of intention. Donald, the 4th child, sits in the middle of a bustling household. His oldest brother, Fred Jr., is already being groomed for the family business. His sister Marianne will become a federal judge. His sister Elizabeth is quiet and steady. His youngest brother Robert will grow close to Donald in ways that will only deepen with time. But it is Donald who catches the eye earliest. Not because he is the most studious, and certainly not because he is the most obedient, but because he radiates a kind of restless, crackling energy that seems too large for any single room to contain. He is, by his own later accounts and by the accounts of those who know him as a child, a handful. He pushes. He tests. He argues. He is competitive in the way that some children are competitive about everything. About who finishes dinner first, about who can throw a ball the farthest, about who is right in a disagreement. Fred Trump, watching his son navigate the world, sees something he recognizes. He sees a fighter. And rather than softening those edges, he sharpens them. The neighborhood of Jamaica Estates gives Donald his first education in real estate without him ever knowing it. He grows up watching his father talk about properties the way other men talk about racehorses, with intimacy, with pride, with an almost physical affection. Fred Trump drives Donald along the streets of Brooklyn and Queens, pointing out buildings the family owns, narrating the histories of neighborhoods, explaining which blocks are rising and which are falling. It is an education conducted not in a classroom, but through a windshield, borough by borough, and it leaves a permanent imprint on the way Donald Trump will come to understand the world, in terms of locations, of buildings, of the tangible and the visible. The public schools of Queens hold Donald's attention only imperfectly. He is bright, no one who encounters him doubts that, but his brightness expresses itself in ways that formal schooling is not always designed to reward. He is not patient with subjects that do not interest him. He is not naturally deferential to authority. He has opinions and he states them, and he is not easily dissuaded from them. Fred Trump watches all of this with the particular combination of pride and pragmatism that defines his parenting, and he makes a decision. If Donald will not be contained, he will be directed. In 1959, at the age of 13, Donald Trump is enrolled at the New York Military Academy in Cornwall-on-Hudson, New York. It is a significant departure. Not a punishment exactly, though discipline is certainly part of the intention, but a redirection of energy toward structure. The academy sits on the western bank of the Hudson River, about 60 miles north of New York City, its grounds rolling and its buildings carrying the deliberate gravity of an institution that takes its mission seriously. It is a place that believes in hierarchy, in order, in the forging of character through rigor and repetition. The New York Military Academy, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, is a world apart from Jamaica Estates. Boys wake at fixed hours. They make their beds with military precision. They march. They drill. They address their superiors with titles. They wear uniforms and the uniforms matter. The cut of a jacket, the shine of a shoe, the precise placement of insignia, because the uniform is the institution's way of saying that identity here is earned through performance. This is not a place that accommodates the casual, the sloppy, or the undisciplined. Donald Trump does not merely survive this environment. He thrives in it. There is something in the military academy's grammar of competition and hierarchy that speaks directly to the part of Donald Trump that is already most fully formed. He understands rank. He understands the relationship between effort and status. He understands that in a world structured by clear rules and visible rewards, the path upward is, at least in theory, legible. You perform. You are recognized. You rise. This is a logic he can work with. He plays baseball and football. He is a physically imposing young man for his age, tall, strong, energetic, and on the athletic field, these qualities translate directly into advantage. But it is not only in sports that he distinguishes himself. He moves through the academy's social structure with a fluency that surprises some of his peers and impresses his instructors. He learns how to read rooms. He learns how to carry himself. He learns the particular art of projecting confidence, which is, in a military environment, almost indistinguishable from leadership itself. By his senior year, Donald Trump has become a cadet captain, one of the highest ranks available to a student at the academy. He is not the most decorated scholar in his class, but he is among the most prominent. His instructors remember him as someone who understood, almost instinctively, the difference between being good at something and being seen to be good at something, and who pursued both with equal seriousness. He graduates from the New York Military Academy in 1964, 18 years old, carrying with him something that no classroom could have given him: a vocabulary of authority. He has learned how to stand at the front of a room. He has learned how to give orders. He has learned that a certain kind of bearing, upright, unruffled, assured, communicates power before a single word is spoken. These are not incidental lessons. They are foundational. The question of what comes next is, in the Trump household, not really a question at all. Fred Trump has always assumed that his sons will enter the world of business, and Donald has always understood this. But the path is not entirely direct. Donald spends 2 years at Fordham University in the Bronx, living closer to home, closer to the city he has grown up watching from a distance. Fordham is a Jesuit institution, intellectually rigorous, serious about ideas, and Donald moves through it with his characteristic combination of engagement and impatience. He is attentive to the things that interest him. He is less attentive to the things that do not. But the years at Fordham serve their purpose. They are a bridge. They are the years in which Donald Trump, now a young man rather than a boy, begins to articulate to himself what he actually wants, which is not simply to succeed, but to succeed in New York, in real estate, in the biggest possible arena. He has grown up watching his father build an empire in the outer boroughs, and he has absorbed the lesson completely. But he has also noticed something: that the outer boroughs, for all their productivity, are not where the most glamorous game is played. The most glamorous game is played in Manhattan. And Manhattan, to Donald Trump at 19 and 20, is a destination. In 1966, he transfers to the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. It is a decision with enormous symbolic weight, and Donald Trump is never unaware of symbolic weight. Wharton, in the mid-1960s, is already considered one of the finest business schools in the country, perhaps the finest. It draws students from across the United States and beyond, children of wealth and ambition who have arrived with sharp minds and sharper elbows, determined to leave with the credentials and the connections that will define the rest of their lives. The campus of the University of Pennsylvania, in West Philadelphia, carries the comfortable authority of an Ivy League institution. The stone buildings, the leafy paths, the sense of accumulated prestige that clings to old universities like a second skin. Among the students who populate Wharton in these years, there is a shared understanding: they are being trained not merely to understand business but to lead it. The curriculum is demanding in the ways that business education at that level is always demanding: finance, economics, real estate, law. But the more lasting education happens in the conversations between classes, in the dormitories and dining halls, in the slow process of understanding how ambition arranges itself in a room full of ambitious people. Donald Trump studies real estate. This is not a surprise to anyone who knows him. He has been, in a sense, studying real estate his entire life, in his father's car, on the streets of Brooklyn and Queens, in the dinner table conversations of Jamaica estates. But Wharton gives him a framework for what he already knows intuitively. It gives him the language of finance, the architecture of deals, the principles of leverage and valuation and risk. He is a good student, not in the sense that he is in love with academic learning for its own sake, but in the sense that he knows exactly what he is there to acquire, and he acquires it. He is remembered by classmates and professors, not as a quiet scholar but as a presence. He has opinions about the real estate market that he is willing to argue for. He pays attention when the discussion turns to Manhattan properties. He talks about his father's work, but he talks about it in a way that suggests he is already thinking past it, already measuring the distance between where Fred Trump has taken the family and where Donald Trump intends to go. He graduates from Wharton in the spring of 1968 with a degree in economics. He is 22 years old. The Vietnam War is convulsing the country. Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy will be shot in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago will end in chaos and violence in August. The world that Donald Trump is graduating into is not a stable world, not a calm world, not a world that offers easy answers about the future. But Donald Trump is not particularly focused on the turbulence around him in the political and cultural sense. He is focused on something more specific, more personal, more immediate. He is focused on New York City. He is focused on Manhattan. He is focused on the question that has been forming in him with increasing clarity since those long drives through Queens with his father years ago. The question is not whether he will build something. That much has always been certain. The question is how large. He returns to New York in the summer of 1968 to join the Trump Organization, the family business that his father has spent decades constructing. He is armed with a Wharton degree, with 5 years of military academy discipline, with the particular hunger of a young man who has grown up in the shadow of a successful father and has spent every year of his education measuring the distance between his father's achievements and his own ambitions. Fred Trump is still very much in charge, and Donald knows this. He is not walking into an empire of his own, not yet. He is walking into an apprenticeship. He is the son. He has the energy and the credentials and the drive, but the empire is his father's, and the lessons that remain to be learned are the ones that no school can teach. The lessons of negotiation in the real world, of banking relationships, of city politics, of the thousand small decisions that accumulate over time into something that can be called an empire. And so Donald Trump, born on Flag Day in a hospital in Queens, raised in a Georgian colonial mansion by a Scottish immigrant mother and a relentless builder of a father, shaped by the Hudson River banks of a military academy and the lecture halls of the finest business school in America, walks through the door of the Trump Organization in the summer of 1968, and the story that everyone will eventually know begins in earnest. He is 22 years old. He has never been more prepared. And he has never been more impatient. The city is waiting. And he is ready for it. Chapter 2. Manhattan's Gilded Entry, 1971 to 1982. There is a particular quality to New York City in the early 1970s that is difficult to convey to anyone who did not live through it. It is not the New York of gleaming towers and curated neighborhoods that a later generation will come to know. It is not the New York of luxury condominiums and artisanal coffee and streets scrubbed clean for the comfort of the affluent. It is something raw, something more desperate, something that smells of possibility and decay in equal measure, a city that is, quite literally, going broke. The fiscal crisis that will officially consume New York City by the middle of the decade is already gathering in the early 1970s like a storm system visible on the horizon. The manufacturing jobs that once anchored the working-class neighborhoods of the outer boroughs are leaving. The middle class is leaving with them, heading to the suburbs of Long Island and New Jersey and Westchester, trading the density and noise of the city for lawns and quiet streets and school districts that have not yet been overwhelmed. The tax base contracts. The services deteriorate. The streets accumulate a grime that is partly physical and partly psychological. The grime of a great city that has begun for the first time in anyone's memory to doubt itself. And yet there are men, a particular kind of man, the kind who reads decline the way a sailor reads weather, not as a reason to stay in port, but as a set of conditions to be navigated, who look at New York in the early 1970s and see something that the frightened and the departing cannot see. They see low prices. They see desperate sellers. They see a city that, whatever its present condition, remains the center of American commerce and culture and finance, and that will not remain broken forever. They see, in other words, opportunity. Donald Trump is 25 years old when he begins to move with serious intention toward Manhattan, and he has been trained by his father and by his own disposition to read the city exactly this way. The Trump Organization that Donald joins in the late 1960s and early 1970s is a substantial enterprise, but it is an enterprise rooted firmly in the outer boroughs, in the rental apartment complexes of Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island that Fred Trump has spent his life building and managing. It is a business of working-class and middle-class tenants, of maintenance schedules and rent collection, and the steady, unglamorous work of keeping large residential properties operational. Fred Trump is proud of what he has built, and he has every reason to be. He has created genuine wealth from almost nothing. But his world has its edges, and Donald can feel them. The edge that matters most is the one at the East River. Manhattan is across that water, and Manhattan is, in every sense that Donald Trump has come to care about, a different universe. It is where the banks are headquartered, and the deals are made, and the newspapers are published, and the names that matter are made. It is where architecture becomes statement rather than shelter. It is where a builder can become not merely wealthy but celebrated, not merely successful but famous. Fred Trump has never made this crossing in any meaningful business sense. He has always understood, with the pragmatism that defines him, that his particular skills and his particular relationships are suited to the boroughs, not to the island. But Donald does not share his father's sense of limitation. He shares, instead, his father's ambition, and he has pointed it somewhere new. The early 1970s are years of watching and learning and positioning. Donald moves into an apartment in Manhattan, a modest one by the standards he intends to establish, and begins the process of inserting himself into the city's business and social networks with the systematic patience of someone who understands that access is not given but constructed, relationship by relationship, room by room. He attends the right events. He cultivates lawyers and bankers and city officials. He reads the newspapers with professional attention, tracking which properties are struggling, which neighborhoods are shifting, which opportunities are accumulating dust for lack of someone willing to see them clearly. He also cultivates Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn is, in the early 1970s, one of the most consequential and most controversial lawyers in New York City. He rose to national prominence in the early 1950s as the chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy during the Army McCarthy hearings, and he has never entirely shed the sulfurous reputation that period earned him. But in New York, reputation is a complicated currency, and Cohn's reputation, aggressive, fearless, politically connected, utterly unwilling to accept defeat as a final condition, is precisely the kind of reputation that certain kinds of clients find invaluable. He knows everyone. He fears nothing. He operates in the spaces between formal rules and informal power with the ease of a man who has spent his entire adult life in those spaces. Donald Trump and Roy Cohn recognize each other almost immediately as kindred spirits in a particular sense. Both are men who believe that the world rewards the bold and punishes the timid, that the first move in any negotiation is to establish that you are not afraid, and that the city, this city, New York, is ultimately a contest, and that the way to win a contest is to want it more than the other man does. Cohn becomes Trump's lawyer, his mentor in the ways of New York power, and in a deeper sense, a kind of mirror in which Trump can see his own instincts reflected and validated. Their relationship will last until Cohn's death, and it will shape Donald Trump's understanding of how the world actually works, as opposed to how it is supposed to work, in ways that no classroom ever could. But it is a particular building, sitting on a particular corner of Midtown Manhattan, that will serve as the stage for Donald Trump's first genuinely transformational act as a developer in his own right. The Commodore Hotel stands at 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue, directly adjacent to Grand Central Terminal, and in the early 1970s, it is a monument to everything that has gone wrong with New York City. It opened in 1919, named for Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad magnate whose family built Grand Central itself. In its prime, the Commodore was a first-class establishment, a place where travelers arriving at Grand Central could step off a train and walk directly into a world of marble lobbies and brass fixtures and the particular comfort that grand hotels of that era provided. Politicians held events there. Businessmen made deals in its restaurants. It was, for a generation, a symbol of Midtown's vitality. By the early 1970s, it is a ruin in slow motion. The neighborhood around Grand Central has deteriorated severely. The streets of 42nd Street between Times Square and the Terminal are, by this point, among the most blighted in the city. Theaters that once showed Broadway productions now show pornographic films. Storefronts are shuttered or occupied by businesses that thrive in darkness. And the population that moves through these blocks after sundown is not the population of commerce and culture but of desperation and danger. The Commodore, sitting at the edge of all this, is hemorrhaging guests and revenue. Its rooms are largely empty. Its physical plant is deteriorating. The Penn Central Railroad, which owns the land beneath the hotel, has itself gone bankrupt, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that point, and the hotel is caught in the legal and financial wreckage of that collapse. The city is considering its options, which include the possibility that the Commodore simply closes, adding one more vacancy to a midtown corridor that can barely absorb the ones it already has. Donald Trump sees something else entirely. He sees location. He sees Grand Central Terminal, one of the great architectural achievements in American history, one of the busiest transit hubs on the eastern seaboard, directly next door. He sees the fact that whatever New York becomes in the future, this corner, this intersection of transportation and commerce, will be at the center of it. He sees a property that is available at a distressed price in a city desperate enough to make deals it would never otherwise consider. And he sees, with the particular clarity of someone who has been studying real estate since childhood, that the distance between what this building is and what it could be is not an obstacle. It is the opportunity itself. He approaches the Penn Central's bankruptcy trustees with an audacity that leaves some of them momentarily speechless. He is, at this point, a young man in his mid-20s with no significant Manhattan projects to his name, proposing to take control of a major midtown hotel and transform it into something that the city's own planners and financiers have largely given up on. The trustees, desperate and with few alternatives, listen. The city's economic development officials, equally desperate, listen. And what they hear, gradually, is not the bravado of a young man who does not understand what he is proposing. It is the pitch of someone who understands it very precisely, who has done the numbers, who knows the financing requirements, and who is prepared to pursue this with a tenacity that none of the more cautious players in the room are willing to match. The deal that Trump constructs around the Commodore Hotel is a masterpiece of financial engineering, and it hinges on something that no private developer had ever successfully obtained for a commercial property in New York City: a tax abatement. Specifically, Trump negotiates a 40-year abatement on property taxes, an arrangement under which the city agrees to forego the taxes it would normally collect on the property in exchange for the economic activity, the jobs, and the revival of a critical midtown block that a successful redevelopment would generate. The tax abatement negotiation is not simple, and it is not quick. It requires the alignment of multiple city agencies, the cooperation of the state's Urban Development Corporation, the approval of elected officials, who are simultaneously under pressure to bring revenue into a nearly bankrupt city, and desperate enough for economic development to consider extraordinary measures. Donald Trump navigates all of this, the bureaucratic layers, the competing interests, the political sensitivities, with a persistence and a sophistication that repeatedly surprises the people across the table from him. He uses Roy Cohn when the situation calls for legal muscle. He uses his own charm and energy when the situation calls for persuasion. He understands with an intuition that seems almost innate which lever to pull in which room, and he pulls them. The partnership he assembles to execute the project includes the Hyatt Corporation, which will operate the hotel under its brand, giving the project the institutional credibility that a 20-something developer from Queens cannot yet supply on his own. Fred Trump co-signs the financing, providing the banking relationships and the parental guarantee that make the numbers work. But the vision, the negotiation, the relentless driving of the project from conception to reality, that belongs to Donald. The Commodore closes in 1975 for its transformation. What emerges from that transformation, when the Grand Hyatt New York opens in September of 1980, is something genuinely startling. The old brick exterior has been replaced entirely with a glass curtain wall that catches the light of the midtown sky and reflects it back in ways that feel almost aggressive. A building announcing itself, refusing to recede into the streetscape, insisting on being noticed. The lobby is a vast, soaring atrium of polished stone and cascading water features and brass accents, a deliberate maximalism, a statement that grandeur has returned to this corner, that the era of decay and apology is over. The reaction is immediate and electric. New Yorkers who have watched the Commodore rot for years walk through the lobby of the Grand Hyatt and experience something that the city has not offered in some time, the sensation of a comeback. The hotel is fully booked almost from its opening. The reviews are rapturous. The city officials, who negotiated the tax abatement, some of whom had private doubts about whether Trump could actually deliver what he promised, attend the opening and speak with the enthusiasm of people who had believed all along. And Donald Trump, 34 years old, stands in the lobby of the building he has transformed, surrounded by the evidence of what he has accomplished, and receives something that will become, for him, nearly as important as the financial reward: the attention of New York City. The newspapers write about him. The gossip columns notice him. The real estate world, which has been watching his progress with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, reassesses. He is not Fred Trump's son, playing at Manhattan real estate. He is a developer, a real one, and he has done something that nobody else was willing or able to do. The Grand Hyatt is not merely a hotel. It is a credential. It is proof of concept. It is the first brick in what Donald Trump is already planning with accelerating ambition, to be something far larger, a presence in Manhattan that will be not merely financial but physical, not merely successful but visible, not merely respected but impossible to ignore. The tax abatement that makes the project financially viable will be examined, debated, and criticized for years to come. Critics will argue, with some justification, that the city gave away a significant revenue stream at a moment of fiscal crisis, enriching a private developer at public expense. Defenders will argue, with equal justification, that a dying hotel block in a dying neighborhood has been restored to life, that jobs have been created, that investment has followed where despair once lived, and that the mathematics of urban revival are rarely as simple as the mathematics of a single property's tax bill. Donald Trump, for his part, does not spend much time on either side of this argument. He has never been a man who dwells on the debates his actions generate, except insofar as those debates keep his name in the newspapers, which they reliably do. He is already looking at the next project, the next site, the next conversation with the next banker or city official or potential partner. He is already, in his mind, somewhere further along the trajectory he has set for himself. The city that surrounds him in the early 1980s is beginning, tentatively, to recover. The fiscal crisis has technically passed. The streets of Midtown, still rough in places, are beginning to attract investment again. A new generation of developers is moving into Manhattan, sensing the same turn in the cycle that Trump sensed a decade earlier. Wall Street is beginning the long expansion that will define the decade. Money is beginning to move again, and money, when it moves toward the visible and the bold. Donald Trump, standing at the opening of the Grand Hyatt in 1980, has made himself both. He has crossed the East River that his father never crossed in any serious business sense. He has put his name, literally, in the earliest expressions of a branding instinct that will only grow more powerful, on a building in the middle of Manhattan. He has demonstrated that he can negotiate with banks, with city agencies, with corporations larger and more established than anything in the Trump organization's history. He has demonstrated that he can deliver. And somewhere not far from where he stands, on Fifth Avenue to be precise, between 56th and 57th Streets, a construction project is already underway. It is a project that will take everything the Grand Hyatt represented and amplify it beyond anything the city has yet seen from this particular young man from Queens. He is already moving. He has always been moving. The Commodore was the opening statement. The next building will be the declaration. Chapter 3. The Skyline Architect, 1983 to 1987. There is a moment in the life of any great city when a building arrives that does not merely add to the skyline but redefines it, when a structure goes up that changes, in some permanent and irreversible way, the vocabulary of what that city believes itself to be. New York has had several such moments across its long history of vertical ambition. The Chrysler Building, ascending in 1930 with its Art Deco crown catching the winter light above Lexington Avenue. The Empire State Building, rising in the same era with a speed and a scale that left the city breathless. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, dominating the downtown skyline with a modernist authority that was, depending on who you asked, either magnificent or severe. In 1983, another such building opens on Fifth Avenue between 56th and 57th Streets in the most expensive and most scrutinized real estate corridor in the United States. It is 58 stories of glass and bronze, rising from a base that includes one of the most dramatic retail atriums in the world, a cascade of pink marble and polished brass, 6 stories of open interior space through which a waterfall descends with deliberate theatricality, surrounded by boutiques and restaurants, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has decided from its first moment of existence that it will not be modest about what it is. It is called Trump Tower, and the man who built it is 36 years old. To understand Trump Tower fully, to understand what it means in the context of its moment and in the context of the man who conceived it, it is necessary to go back a few years to the site on which it stands and the negotiation that secured it. The building that previously occupied the northeast corner of 5th Avenue and 56th Street was Bonwit Teller, a luxury department store of considerable distinction and considerable age, a retailer that had been a fixture of that particular stretch of 5th Avenue since the 1930s, and whose building, constructed in the Art Deco style of that era, was itself considered a significant piece of New York's architectural heritage. The building's facade included decorative friezes and a pair of Art Deco grillwork panels that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had expressed interest in preserving. Donald Trump acquired the Bonwit Teller site in the late 1970s through a combination of negotiation and the kind of aggressive financial positioning that was becoming his signature. The deal to demolish the old building and construct something entirely new in its place required navigating the concerns of preservationists, the logistics of a major demolition in the middle of one of the busiest commercial corridors in the world, and the practical challenge of what to do with the thousands of Bonwit Teller employees whose livelihoods depended on the store continuing to operate while the transition was arranged. The demolition, when it comes, is not without controversy. The Art Deco panels that the Metropolitan Museum had hoped to preserve are destroyed, Trump's representatives citing the cost and the delay that careful removal would require. The decision generates criticism, and the criticism generates newspaper coverage, and the newspaper coverage generates something that is, by this point in his career, almost indistinguishable from oxygen for Donald Trump: attention. He responds to the criticism with the directness that will become his public trademark. He is building something extraordinary, he argues, something that will give New York far more than it loses, and the people who want to freeze the city in amber in order to preserve the relics of a less ambitious past are welcome to their nostalgia. The architecture of Trump Tower is the work of Der Scutt, a prominent architect whose vision for the building aligns precisely with Trump's own instincts about what the structure should communicate. The glass curtain wall is dark bronze in color, not the blue or silver glass of conventional Midtown towers, but something warmer, something that catches the light differently at different hours of the day, something that reads as rich rather than merely modern. The serrated, sawtooth profile of the tower's exterior creates a series of setbacks that give the building an unusual silhouette, recognizable from a distance, impossible to confuse with anything else on the skyline. This is deliberate. Everything about Trump Tower is deliberate. The atrium at the base of the building is the element that most dramatically announces the building's intentions. In an era of Midtown lobbies that are often perfunctory, transitional spaces between the street and the elevator, designed for efficiency rather than experience, the Trump Tower atrium is a destination in itself. The pink marble, quarried in Italy and chosen with the particular obsessiveness that Trump brings to every material decision in his buildings, lines the floors and walls in a palette that is simultaneously luxurious and warm. The brass fixtures gleam. The waterfall, 6 stories of moving water descending through the open atrium, provides both visual drama and the constant soothing presence of sound that transforms the space from a lobby into something closer to a theater. Shoppers and tourists and residents move through it in the early months of its opening with the slightly dazzled expression of people who are not entirely sure whether they are in a building or an experience. The residential component of Trump Tower occupies the upper floors, and here too the calculations are precise and intentional. Trump has decided, based on his reading of the Manhattan luxury market, based on conversations with brokers and financiers, based on the simple logic that the most expensive addresses in the city are the ones with the most famous names attached to them, that Trump Tower will be sold not merely as real estate but as a statement of arrival. To live at Trump Tower is not to purchase an apartment. It is to purchase a position, a location in the city's social geography that announces, to anyone who knows New York, that the person living there has reached a particular altitude. The marketing of the residences is, by the standards of its era, extraordinarily sophisticated. Trump understands with an instinct that is years ahead of the real estate industry's general practice that luxury is not primarily a material condition, but a narrative one. It is not simply about the quality of the marble or the view from the windows, though both of these matter enormously, and Trump attends to both with relentless specificity. It is about the story that the address tells, and who else has chosen to tell that story from the same building. The celebrity residents who move into Trump Tower in its early years, the entertainers, the financiers, the international figures of wealth and prominence, are not incidental to the building's commercial success. They are part of its product offering. Their presence confirms the narrative, and the narrative justifies the prices, and the prices confirm the narrative. It is a self-reinforcing loop of aspiration and validation, and Trump engineers it with a precision that his competitors for some years struggled to match or even fully understand. His own apartment, on the upper floors of the building, is the ultimate expression of his aesthetic philosophy, a space of gold leaf and mirrors and marble that is, by the standards of conventional interior design, entirely excessive, and by the standards of Donald Trump's sensibility, entirely coherent. It is a space designed not for the approval of design critics, who will largely respond to it with horror, but for the expression of a particular idea, that success, genuine success, should be visible. That the man who has built this building, and fills it with these materials, and lives at its apex, is not making an apology for his ambitions. He is making a monument to them. Trump Tower opens to the public in 1983 and becomes, almost immediately, one of the most visited addresses in New York City. People who have no intention of buying an apartment or shopping in the atrium come simply to see it, to walk through the marble lobby, to stand near the waterfall, to look up through the cascading open space of the interior, and experience the particular sensation of being inside a building that believes, without qualification, in its own magnificence. The atrium becomes a tourist attraction in the truest sense, a place that people travel specifically to experience. For a commercial real estate development, this is an extraordinary outcome, and it is not accidental. The opening of Trump Tower marks a transition in Donald Trump's public identity that is as significant as any single deal he has made. Before Trump Tower, he is a respected and increasingly prominent New York developer, a man who has accomplished things in Manhattan, who has demonstrated real skill and tenacity, who has navigated the Commodore Hotel project with a sophistication that the real estate world has noticed and credited. After Trump Tower, he is something more and something different. He is a brand. He is a name that people who know nothing about real estate recognize, because the name is on the building, and the building is on Fifth Avenue, and Fifth Avenue is, in the imagination of the world, synonymous with New York, and New York is synonymous with ambition itself. The press takes notice in ways that go beyond the real estate pages. The gossip columns, already beginning to track his movements, intensify their coverage. The tabloids, those great newspapers of New York's daily drama, begin to treat him not as a businessman to be covered by business reporters, but as a figure, a character in the city's ongoing story of itself, to be tracked and written about by the full range of their staffs. He is photographed. He is quoted. He is invited to the right events, and to events that become the right events because he attends them. He is also, at this time, moving in the social orbit of Ivana Trump, his wife since 1977, who is herself a significant presence in the city's social life, a woman of elegance and energy and considerable business acumen who will play a genuine role in the management of several Trump properties over the coming years. Together, they are a New York couple of a particular kind, visible, glamorous, competitive in the way that the most ambitious people in the most ambitious city on earth tend to be competitive. They are photographed together at charity galas and restaurant openings and the various theatrical productions of New York's social season. They are, in the language of the tabloids, a power couple, and the tabloids of the early 1980s are very much in love with both of them. But even as Trump Tower is ascending to its position as the most talked-about address in Manhattan, Donald Trump's attention is moving, as it always moves, to the next acquisition, the next property, the next project that will extend his reach and his name into territory not yet claimed. The property in question sits not in the vertical density of Manhattan, but on the flat subtropical edge of Palm Beach, Florida, facing the Atlantic Ocean from a parcel of land so extraordinary in its dimensions and its beauty that it seems, even by the standards of American excess, almost improbable. It is called Mar-a-Lago, and it is, in every meaningful sense, a palace. Mar-a-Lago was built between 1924 and 1927 for Marjorie Merriweather Post, the serial heiress who was, at the time of its construction, one of the wealthiest women in the United States. Post commissioned the architect Marion Sims Wyeth and the interior designer Joseph Urban to create something that would serve as a winter residence of appropriate grandeur. And what they produced is a structure of 128 rooms, 17 of which are bathrooms, 33 of which are bedrooms, spread across 17 acres of land between the Atlantic Ocean on the east and Lake Worth on the west. The name itself means, in Spanish, sea to lake, and the estate earns it. Standing at certain points on the grounds, you can see water in both directions, the estate sitting like a ship between two bodies of water, the Atlantic and the lake framing it from opposite sides with the flat blue certainty of Florida sky above. The architecture is a synthesis that could exist nowhere but in America. Spanish, Venetian, and Moorish elements combined in a confection of towers and loggias and courtyards, and ceilinged rooms decorated with Dorian stone imported from Genoa and tiles handmade in Spain, and a living room modeled to the precise inch on a room in a Venetian palace. Marjorie Merriweather Post lived in it with the unapologetic extravagance of someone for whom extravagance is not a choice but a condition of existence, and when she died in 1973, she bequeathed it to the United States government, imagining it as a presidential retreat, a winter White House of the nation. The government, proving once again its reliable inability to recognize a gift when one is offered, declined to maintain it. The costs were too high. The logistical complications were too numerous. The government returned the property to the Post Foundation in 1981, and the foundation, equally uncertain what to do with a 128-room Venetian Spanish-Moorish palace on the Atlantic coast of Florida, put it on the market. Donald Trump buys Mar-a-Lago in 1985 for approximately $8 million, a price that, even by the standards of a depressed South Florida luxury market, is remarkable for a property of this scale and history. The negotiation that produces this price is characteristically Trumpian. He has studied the property. He understands that the foundation is under pressure to sell, and he applies the leverage of that understanding with patience and calculation, arriving at a figure that represents, by any reasonable assessment, one of the great real estate bargains of the decade. The acquisition of Mar-a-Lago is significant for reasons that go beyond its financial dimensions. It represents a geographic expansion of the Trump identity, a signal that the story is not confined to New York, that the ambitions at play here are national in their scope. It is also, in a more personal sense, a statement of arrival of a particular and deeply felt kind. Mar-a-Lago is not merely a large house in Florida. It is an estate with a history, a place associated with one of the great American fortunes of the 20th century, a place where presidents and ambassadors and cultural figures of the highest prominence have been guests. To own it is to step into a lineage of American wealth and power that goes back generations, and Donald Trump, the grandson of a German immigrant and the son of an outer borough homebuilder, steps into it without any visible hesitation. He begins renovating it almost immediately, not with the intention of museum-quality restoration, but with the intention of making it livable and magnificent in the way that Trump properties are always livable and magnificent. Rooms are restored and augmented. The grounds are tended with the same obsessive attention he brings to every property he owns. Mar-a-Lago becomes, in the years that follow, both a private residence and a social stage, a place where the rhythm of the Palm Beach social season finds one of its most glamorous nodes, where guests arrive for dinners and events and parties that are, like almost everything Donald Trump organizes, conducted at a scale that makes moderation seem like a personal failing. He will later convert it to a private club, opening its gates to a membership that will pay handsomely for the privilege of moving through rooms that once entertained the most powerful figures of a previous American era. But in the mid-1980s, it is his winter retreat, his Florida anchor, his monument to the proposition that a man from Queens with sufficient drive and sufficient vision can acquire, if he chooses, the finest things that American wealth has produced. And then, in 1987, something happens that is entirely without precedent in Donald Trump's career to this point, something that will prove, in the fullness of time, to be almost as consequential as any building he has ever constructed. He writes a book. The Art of the Deal is published in November of 1987 by Random House, co-written with the journalist Tony Schwartz. And it is, in its genre, in its moment, in its particular combination of business instruction and personal mythology, unlike anything the publishing world has seen in some years. It is not a conventional business book. It is not a dry accounting of real estate principles or financial strategies. though it contains elements of both. It is, at its core, a story. The story of Donald Trump as he wishes to be understood, narrated in a voice that is simultaneously confiding and confident, intimate and boastful, the voice of a man who has decided that the most effective way to communicate his philosophy is to make it entertaining. The opening chapters establish the voice immediately. A week in the life of Donald Trump. The calls, the meetings, the decisions, the deals in progress, and the deals being conceived, rendered in a prose style that is direct and propulsive and stripped of any false modesty. He is, the book makes clear on nearly every page, someone who operates at the highest levels of American business and does so with a naturalness and an energy that other men who went to the same schools and came from similar backgrounds, simply cannot match. The book does not claim this explicitly. It demonstrates it, anecdote by anecdote, deal by deal, in a way that is more persuasive and more pleasurable to read than any explicit claim could be. The business philosophy that emerges across the book's pages is not complicated, but it is coherent, and it is genuinely his. Think big. Protect the downside. Maximize your options. Know your market. Use leverage. Get the word out. Deliver the goods. These are not revolutionary ideas. There is nothing in the art of the deal that a serious student of business history would find entirely new, but they are stated with a clarity and a confidence, and a grounding in specific, vivid, real-world experience that gives them the authority of earned wisdom rather than theoretical prescription. The book is also, deliberately and skillfully, a piece of brand construction of the highest order. Every anecdote reinforces the same essential portrait. A man who sees what others miss, who moves faster than his competitors, who negotiates from a position of psychological strength, even when the objective conditions might not justify it, who understands that confidence, projected at sufficient volume and with sufficient consistency, eventually becomes indistinguishable from competence in the minds of the people watching. It is a portrait drawn with obvious bias, but with enough specific detail and enough genuine insight into the mechanics of New York real estate to carry conviction. The Art of the Deal reaches the top of the New York Times bestseller list and stays there for months. It sells over 1 million copies. It is reviewed, discussed, argued about, recommended. In airport bookstores and corporate offices and suburban living rooms across the United States, people who have never thought seriously about New York real estate and have no intention of ever entering a negotiation over a midtown development site, pick it up and read it because it is, above all, a compelling story about a compelling man. And compelling stories about compelling men are one of the most durable commodities in the history of the publishing business. The cultural impact of The Art of the Deal is difficult to overstate in the context of its era. The mid to late 1980s are years of extraordinary financial energy in the United States. Years when Wall Street is producing a generation of young men who are making more money faster than any generation before them, when the idea that wealth is not merely acceptable but admirable, not merely desirable but evidence of fundamental human excellence, is somewhere near the peak of its cultural influence. Into this climate, The Art of the Deal arrives like a confirmation of something the decade has been trying to say about itself, a book that makes the case with confidence and narrative skill, that the pursuit of the deal, the acquisition of the trophy, the building of the empire, is not merely a commercial activity but an art form worthy of the same serious attention one might give to any other form of human creativity. Donald Trump, by the close of 1987, is 41 years old. He has put his name on one of the most recognized buildings in one of the most famous cities in the world. He has acquired a Florida estate of near-legendary provenance. He has written a book that millions of people have read, and that has installed his name and his face and his philosophy into the cultural conversation of an entire nation. He has, in the span of roughly 15 years, traveled an almost incomprehensible distance from the construction sites of Brooklyn and Queens, where his father once pointed out family-owned buildings through a car window. He has crossed not only the East River, but every boundary that the world of Fred Trump's generation took to be fixed and final. He is not merely wealthy. He is famous. He is not merely successful. He is, in the particular vocabulary of the 1980s, iconic. And yet, and this is the thing about Donald Trump that is most consistent across the entire arc of his life, the thing that makes him most fundamentally himself, he is not satisfied. He is never satisfied. Satisfaction is, for him, the condition that precedes stagnation, and stagnation is the one thing he cannot abide. The skyline he has already changed is not the final skyline. The deals he has already made are not the final deals. The name he has already built is not yet the name he intends to have. He is already reaching for something more. He is always reaching for something more. Chapter 4. Atlantic City and the Casino Empire, 1988 to 1991. There is a particular kind of American city that exists nowhere else on earth. A city that has staked its entire identity, its entire economy, its entire reason for being on the proposition that people will travel from considerable distances to lose money in a controlled and carefully decorated environment. Las Vegas is the most famous of these cities, but Las Vegas, by the late 1980s, has already completed its transformation from a desert outpost of organized crime into a corporate entertainment destination of global recognition. Las Vegas, in other words, has already been won. The frontier has closed there. Atlantic City is different. Atlantic City, sitting on a narrow barrier island on the southern coast of New Jersey, facing the Atlantic Ocean with the particular combination of defiance and desperation that characterizes cities that have fallen far from a great height, is a frontier of a different and more complicated kind. It was, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the premier resort destinations on the eastern seaboard, a place where the middle classes of Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore came by the trainload to walk the boardwalk, breathe the sea air, stay in the great hotels that lined the shore, and experience the particular liberation that the seaside has always offered to people whose daily lives are conducted far from it. The Miss America pageant was born here. The saltwater taffy was invented here. The boardwalk, the original boardwalk, gave its name to the most coveted property in the most played board game in American history. But the post-war decades are not kind to Atlantic City. The rise of commercial aviation makes the beaches of Florida and the Caribbean accessible to the same middle-class families who once filled the shore hotels of New Jersey. And those families, given the choice between a February weekend in Atlantic City and a February weekend in Miami, make the obvious decision. The great hotels empty. The boardwalk deteriorates. The city, stripped of its tourist economy and possessing little else in the way of economic foundation, slides into a poverty that is particularly visible and particularly harsh against the backdrop of what it once was. By the 1970s, Atlantic City is among the poorest cities in the United States, its vacancy rate staggering, its infrastructure crumbling, its population diminished and aging and without obvious prospects. In 1976, the state of New Jersey holds a referendum on casino gambling, and the voters of New Jersey approve it, specifically for Atlantic City, and specifically with the promise that the revenues generated will fund programs for the elderly and disabled. It is an act of considerable desperation, dressed in the language of social policy, and it transforms Atlantic City overnight, or nearly overnight, from a city with no future into a city with a very particular future. A future built entirely on the house edge, on the mathematics of games designed so that the player loses over time, on the conversion of human hope into corporate revenue. The first casinos open in 1978, and the money follows immediately. Resorts International opens first, and the lines of people waiting to enter on its opening weekend stretch for blocks in a display of pent-up demand that confirms what the referendum's supporters had promised. Within a year, Atlantic City has surpassed Las Vegas as the most visited gambling destination in the United States, measured by the number of visitors. The casinos multiply. The investment pours in. The boardwalk, which a decade earlier was a study in municipal decay, becomes a corridor of neon and glass, and the particular feverish energy of a place where large sums of money are changing hands every hour of every day. Donald Trump watches all of this from Manhattan with the same attention he brings to any market that is generating unusual returns, and what he sees is not simply a gambling boom. What he sees is a real estate opportunity of exceptional scale, a city where the demand for new casino space is outpacing the supply, where the barriers to entry are high enough to limit competition but not so high as to be prohibitive, and where the right property, built at the right scale with the right brand attached to it, could generate revenues that dwarf anything available in the New York real estate market. He enters Atlantic City in the early 1980s, and his first property there is Trump Plaza, a casino hotel that opens on the boardwalk in 1984. It is a successful property, profitable, well located, generating the kind of steady cash flows that validate his initial instinct about the market. But Trump Plaza, for all its success, is not what Donald Trump has in his mind when he thinks about what Atlantic City can be for him. It is a beginning. It is the proof of concept for something far larger, far more ambitious, far more consistent with the scale at which he has always preferred to operate. What he has in his mind is the Taj Mahal. The Trump Taj Mahal Casino Resort. The name itself is an act of extraordinary braggadocio, an invocation of one of the most beautiful buildings in human history, as a reference point for a casino on the New Jersey shore, is conceived in the mid-1980s and constructed across the latter half of the decade at a cost that, by the time it opens, will approach $1 billion. It is, at the moment of its opening in April of 1990, the largest casino in the world. It contains more than 4,000 slot machines. Its gaming floor covers more than 130,000 square feet. Its hotel tower rises to 40 stories above the boardwalk. Its facade is ornamented with minarets and domes, and the kind of architectural exuberance that is either magnificent or grotesque, depending entirely on your relationship to excess. And Donald Trump, as has been well established by this point in his life, has a very clear relationship to excess. He is in favor of it. The scale of the Taj Mahal is not merely a matter of ego, though ego is certainly present. It is also a calculated market strategy. Trump's logic, stated plainly, is that the biggest casino will attract the biggest players, that high rollers, the gamblers who arrive by private jet and sit at tables with minimum bets in the thousands of dollars, will be drawn to the property that offers the most opulent experience, the highest ceilings, the most dramatic setting for the particular ritual of wagering large sums of money. He is not wrong about this, in principle. The high roller market is real, and it is enormously lucrative, and the casino that captures it successfully can generate revenues that justify almost any investment in its construction. But to build $1 billion casino, you need $1 billion, and this is where the story of the Taj Mahal takes a turn that will define not only this project, but the entire arc of Trump's financial life for the next several years. The financing of the Taj Mahal relies heavily on junk bonds, high-yield, high-risk debt instruments that were, in the late 1980s, at the absolute peak of their influence in American finance, associated most prominently with the investment bank Drexel Burnham Lambert and its most celebrated practitioner, Michael Milken. Junk bonds, the name itself is a piece of Wall Street vernacular that obscures more than it reveals, are bonds issued by companies that do not qualify for investment-grade credit ratings. Because they carry higher risk of default, they must offer higher interest rates to attract buyers, and in the bull market of the mid to late 1980s, there is no shortage of buyers willing to accept that trade. The junk bond market has financed a generation of leveraged buyouts, corporate restructurings, and ambitious development projects, and it has made fortunes for the bankers and investors who have mastered its mechanics. For Donald Trump, junk bonds offer the ability to borrow at a scale that conventional bank financing would not support, against an asset, the Taj Mahal, that does not yet exist and therefore cannot demonstrate the operating history that banks typically require before extending large credit facilities. The bonds are sold to investors on the promise of the Taj Mahal's future revenues, on the proposition that a casino of this scale and this quality, operated under the Trump brand in the largest gambling market on the eastern seaboard, will generate sufficient cash flow to service the debt comfortably and still return a profit. The interest rates on these bonds are high, in some tranches approaching 14% annually. This is not a trivial burden. For every $100 million borrowed at 14%, the annual interest payment alone is $14 million, and the Taj Mahal is not borrowing $100 million. It is borrowing, across its various debt instruments, in the vicinity of $800 million. The math of this obligation, the sheer weight of the interest payments that must be met before a single dollar of profit can be recognized, is sobering to anyone who examines it carefully. There are people, within the Atlantic City casino industry, and within the financial community that is financing the project, who examine it carefully and find it troubling. They note that even the most optimistic projections for the Taj Mahal's revenues require the property to capture an extraordinarily high percentage of the Atlantic City gambling market, a percentage that implies not merely success but dominance, not merely a good casino, but a casino that draws visitors away from every competing property on the boardwalk. They note that Atlantic City's growth, while impressive, is not unlimited, that the market has expanded dramatically since 1978, but that it has also, by the mid to late 1980s, begun to show signs of maturation, of approaching something like its natural ceiling. They note that Trump already owns Trump Plaza, and that the Taj Mahal, if it performs as projected, will cannibalize some portion of Trump Plaza's business simply by virtue of proximity and competition. These concerns are raised in various forms, in various rooms, by various people. Donald Trump, characteristically, is not persuaded by them. He has heard cautious voices before. At the Commodore Hotel, at Trump Tower, at every stage of his career where he has proposed something larger and more ambitious than the conventional wisdom suggested was advisable, and the cautious voices have, in his experience, consistently underestimated what he is capable of delivering. He has bet on himself before, and won. He is betting on himself again. The construction of the Taj Mahal proceeds across the late 1980s, with the combination of frenetic energy and periodic chaos that seems to attend all of Trump's largest projects. There are contractor disputes and design changes, and the inevitable complications of building a structure of this complexity on a tight urban site in a city whose infrastructure is not always equal to the demands being placed on it. Trump involves himself in the details with the hands-on intensity that is his management style. The phone calls at all hours, the visits to the construction site, the insistence on specific materials and specific finishes and specific dimensions that reflect his personal aesthetic rather than the contractor's convenience. He is also, during this period, managing two other Atlantic City casino properties, Trump Plaza and Trump's Castle, a Marina District property that he has acquired and rebranded. And the Trump organization as a whole is operating at a level of complexity and leverage that would test the management capacity of a much larger and more institutionally sophisticated organization. There are properties in New York. There is Mar-a-Lago. There are the ongoing demands of the Trump brand, which is generating licensing inquiries and partnership proposals from every direction. There are the social obligations of being, by this point, one of the most famous businessmen in America. And there is the art of the deal's success, which has created a demand for Trump's presence, as a speaker, as an interviewee, as a public figure whose opinions on business and finance are sought by newspapers and television programs with increasing frequency. He is, in short, everywhere, which means that in a practical sense, he is sometimes insufficiently present in the specific places where his attention is most urgently needed. The Taj Mahal opens on April 2, 1990, with a ceremony of appropriately theatrical scale. There are celebrities and politicians and gamblers and tourists, and the full apparatus of a Trump promotional event, which by this point is a well-developed art form in itself. The gaming floor opens to crowds that confirm, in the short term, the most optimistic projections. People come in enormous numbers to see the largest casino in the world, to sit at its tables and feed its slot machines, and experience the spectacle of a building that has decided in every possible dimension to be too much. Michael Jackson performs at the opening celebration. The press coverage is vast and largely rapturous. Trump moves through the property with the proprietary satisfaction of a man surveying the largest thing he has ever built, and it is the largest thing he has ever built. And the satisfaction is genuine and visible and, in the moment, entirely justified. But the moment is brief. The broader economic environment of 1990 is deteriorating with a speed that catches many observers by surprise. The long expansion of the 1980s, the bull market, the junk bond boom, the decade of leveraged ambition, is ending, and it is ending badly. The savings and loan crisis is consuming hundreds of financial institutions across the country and will eventually cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. The commercial real estate market, which has been inflated by the same easy credit that financed the casino boom, is collapsing in markets across the United States. Banks that were lending aggressively in 1987 and 1988 are retrenching in 1990 and 1991, calling loans, tightening standards, and discovering, with the particular horror of institutions that have confused a rising market with their own wisdom, that many of their assets are worth significantly less than their books suggest. Atlantic City is not immune to any of this. The gambling revenues that the Taj Mahal needs to service its debt are not materializing at the projected levels. The property is performing well by any ordinary standard. It is a busy, popular casino, generating substantial revenues, but the ordinary standard is not the relevant one. The relevant standard is the extraordinary one built into the bond covenants, the interest payment schedules, the financial models that justified the borrowing. And against that standard, the Taj Mahal is falling short. The interest payments alone on the Taj Mahal's debt are running at roughly $1 million a day. Every day that the casino opens its doors, before a single card is dealt or a single slot machine is played, $1 million of its revenue is already spoken for. This is not a sustainable condition, and in November of 1990, less than 8 months after its triumphant opening, the Taj Mahal misses a bond payment. The financial distress, once it becomes visible at the Taj Mahal, spreads quickly to Trump's other properties and to his personal finances, which are intertwined with his business finances in ways that in better times seemed like strength, the personal guarantee, the willingness to put his own name and his own balance sheet behind his projects, but that now reveal themselves as a structural vulnerability. Trump Plaza, Atlantic City is struggling. Trump's castle is struggling. The Plaza Hotel in New York, which Trump has acquired in 1988 for a price that, in retrospect, reflects the peak optimism of the decade, is struggling. Properties in New York City real estate, which has entered a severe downturn of its own, are worth less than they were when the loans against them were written. The banks, a consortium of them, holding billions of dollars of Trump-related debt across dozens of instruments, convene in the way that banks convene when a major borrower is in distress, carefully, anxiously, and with the dawning recognition that their individual interests may not align perfectly with the collective interest of managing a workout without triggering a catastrophic collapse. What follows across 1990 and into 1991 is one of the most complex and consequential financial restructurings in the history of American real estate. Trump's personal financial situation deteriorates to the point where, by some accounts, his net worth is negative, where the obligations he carries exceed the assets he holds, at least at the market prices that a distressed sale would produce. He is, in the clinical language of finance, technically insolvent, though the distance between technical insolvency and actual bankruptcy depends entirely on whether the banks decide to foreclose or to restructure. The banks decide to restructure. This decision is not made out of affection for Donald Trump, and it is not made without considerable internal debate. It is made out of the cold calculation that a controlled restructuring, renegotiating terms, extending maturities, reducing interest rates, accepting lower recoveries on some instruments, will produce better outcomes for the banks than a chaotic liquidation of assets into a depressed market. A fire sale of Trump properties in 1990 and 1991 would generate prices that would leave the banks with losses far larger than the concessions required by a negotiated workout. And so the banks negotiate. And Donald Trump, sitting across from teams of bankers and lawyers who hold his financial life in their hands, negotiates back. He negotiates with the same intensity and the same psychological fortitude that he has brought to every negotiation of his career: the refusal to show fear, the insistence on his own continued indispensability, the argument that the brand, his brand, the name on the buildings and the casinos and the hotels, retains a value that makes his continued involvement in managing the assets worth paying for. He negotiates, in short, for his survival, and he is very good at it. The personal allowance arrangement that emerges from these negotiations, under which Trump is provided with a monthly living allowance of $450,000 while his finances are being restructured, is one of the more remarkable details of this entire period. It is an arrangement that reflects the bank's determination to keep Trump functional and cooperative during the workout process, and it is also an arrangement that provides a certain dark comedy in the context of a man whose public image has been built so thoroughly on the idea of limitless personal wealth. The man who wrote The Art of the Deal, who lives at the top of the most famous building on Fifth Avenue, who owns a 128-room palace in Palm Beach, is receiving a monthly allowance from his creditors. He does not, characteristically, dwell on the irony. He is focused, with the same relentless forward orientation that has defined his entire adult life, on the next move. The restructuring is not the end. It is a complication, a severe one, a humbling one, a financially devastating one, but it is not the end. The Taj Mahal will go through bankruptcy proceedings. Trump Plaza hotels will file for bankruptcy protection. The financial structure of Trump's Atlantic City empire will be reorganized, diluted, and partially surrendered to creditors. His personal net worth will take years to fully recover. But the buildings will still be there. The name will still be there. And the man, that particular combination of audacity and resilience and absolute refusal to accept a narrative in which he is the permanent loser, will still be there. The story of Atlantic City and the casino empire is, in one reading, a story of overreach, of a man who borrowed too much, projected too confidently, and built too large for the market conditions that actually prevailed. It is a story about the limits of leverage, about the danger of debt structures that leave no margin for error, about the way that the same psychological qualities that produce extraordinary successes can, in different circumstances, produce extraordinary failures. But it is also, in another reading, a story about survival, about a man who stares into the genuine possibility of permanent ruin and does not flinch, about a negotiator who, stripped of the advantages that wealth and momentum had always given him, discovers that his most durable asset was never the buildings or the bonds or the balance sheet. It was always the name, and the name, through all of it, endures. Chapter 5. Collapse and the Comeback, 1992 to 1999. There is a particular kind of mourning that arrives in the life of a man who has fallen from a great height, a mourning that is, on its surface, indistinguishable from any other mourning, the light coming through the windows at the same angle, the city making the same sounds below, and yet carrying with it a weight and a quality of reckoning that ordinary mournings do not possess. It is the morning after the story has changed. The morning after the newspapers have stopped describing you the way they once described you, and begun describing you in a new way, a way that is cooler, more clinical, more interested in the distance between what you claim to be and what the evidence now suggests you are. Donald Trump has several such mornings in the early 1990s, and he has them in the most public possible setting, in a city that invented the tabloid newspaper, that elevated gossip to an art form, that has always understood the fall from grace as one of the most compelling narratives in the human repertoire, second only to the rise. New York in the early 1990s watches Donald Trump's financial difficulties with the particular combination of schadenfreude and genuine fascination that attaches to the misfortunes of the very famous. The headlines are not gentle. The columnists are not restrained. The same press apparatus that spent the better part of a decade celebrating him as the embodiment of a certain kind of American success now pivots with the practiced ease of an institution that has always known this pivot was coming, toward the story of his unraveling. The unraveling is real. That must be stated plainly, because Donald Trump will spend considerable energy in the years that follow contesting its dimensions, and the contest itself will become part of the story. But the underlying facts are not seriously disputed. By 1992, the Trump Organization is navigating the aftermath of multiple corporate bankruptcies. The Taj Mahal has filed for Chapter 11 protection in 1991. Trump Plaza Hotel in New York files in the same year, and the broader restructuring of his Atlantic City holdings is an ongoing and deeply complicated process involving dozens of creditors, hundreds of lawyers, and financial terms that represent, in every meaningful sense, a significant surrender of the empire he spent the 1980s constructing. The Chapter 11 process, bankruptcy protection under the United States Code that allows a company to continue operating while reorganizing its debts, is, in the American legal and financial system, a tool designed precisely for situations like this one. It is not, technically, a personal bankruptcy. Trump is careful to maintain this distinction, and the distinction is legally real. It is the corporate entities that file, not Donald Trump the individual. His personal finances remain separate, restructured through the bank workout agreements rather than through the courts. But the practical consequences for his public identity are significant regardless of the technical categorization. The word bankruptcy, once attached to your name in the newspapers of New York, does not easily detach itself. The Atlantic City properties emerge from their respective bankruptcies reorganized and diminished, Trump's ownership stakes reduced, the debt structures renegotiated, The terms of his involvement as manager and brand licensor formalized in ways that acknowledge the new reality of his leverage with his creditors, which is considerably less than it was in 1988. He retains involvement. He retains the name on the buildings. But the empire, as it existed in the imagination of the public and in the reality of the balance sheet, is not what it was. The Plaza Hotel in New York, which he purchased in 1988 for approximately $407 million, a price that represented the absolute peak of his 1980s ambitions, the acquisition of the most storied hotel address in the most storied city in the country, the fulfillment of a fantasy that even for Donald Trump required a moment of acknowledgement, is lost to the banks in 1992. The Plaza goes to its creditors, the debt resolved through a transfer of equity that leaves Trump with a minority interest and no operational control. The hotel that he once described as the most beautiful in the world, the hotel where Ivana Trump served as president with genuine competence and genuine pride, passes out of his hands with the quiet finality of a foreclosure. Ivana Trump is, by this point, no longer his wife. The marriage that produced 3 children, Donald Jr., born in 1977, Ivanka, born in 1981, and Eric, born in 1984, and that served for over a decade as one of the most visible partnerships in New York's social life, ends in divorce in 1991 after the tabloids document, in their characteristically comprehensive fashion, Trump's relationship with Marla Maples, a Georgia-born actress and model whom he will marry in December of 1993. The divorce proceedings are themselves a tabloid event of considerable magnitude. The details of the settlement, the competing narratives of the marriage's dissolution, the involvement of high-profile lawyers on both sides, all of it conducted in the full and merciless light of New York's media attention. The personal and the financial unravelings occur simultaneously, and this simultaneity is not incidental. They feed each other in the press coverage, each story amplifying the other, creating a composite narrative of a man whose decade of triumphant ascent has given way to a season of loss. Loss of properties, loss of a marriage, loss of the particular golden aura that Trump Tower and the art of the deal and the covers of Forbes magazine had constructed around him in the 1980s. The New York that once celebrated him is now conducting, with evident relish, a very public reassessment. And yet, the reassessment does not produce what most people in Donald Trump's position would find it produced: a retreat, a quieting, a period of chastened reconsideration conducted away from the public eye. Trump responds to the reassessment the way he has responded to every adverse condition in his life, by continuing to talk, continuing to assert, continuing to project a confidence in his own future that the objective circumstances of his present do not obviously justify. He gives interviews in which he describes the restructuring as a masterstroke of negotiation, in which he reframes the surrendered properties as strategic retreats rather than defeats, in which he insists, with the particular conviction of someone who either genuinely believes it or has decided that belief and performance are, in the relevant circumstances, the same thing, that the story is not over. He is correct. But the path back is longer and stranger than even his optimism would have suggested. The early 1990s are years of genuine austerity in the Trump Organization, a term that requires some qualification, given that austerity is relative and that even a diminished Donald Trump is not living in circumstances that would be recognizable as hardship to most people. But relative to the scale of his 1980s operations, relative to the deals being made and the properties being acquired and the sheer velocity of his business life in that decade, the early 1990s are quiet. The banks are watching. The creditors are watching. The terms of his various restructuring agreements impose constraints on his ability to borrow and invest. He is, for the first time in his adult business life, operating within limits that he has not chosen and cannot immediately escape. He uses the time to think. This is perhaps the most important and least discussed aspect of the early 1990s in the Trump story, the degree to which a man who is usually in motion, usually on the phone, usually generating the next deal, is forced by circumstances into something more like reflection. He is not, by temperament or by training, a man who values stillness. But the stillness of constrained options, the inability to simply move on to the next acquisition, the next project, the next expansion, produces something useful. It produces a clearer understanding of what, in the full range of assets he possesses, is truly durable and what is merely contingent. The conclusion he reaches, gradually and then with increasing certainty, is that the durable asset is the name, not the buildings. Buildings can be lost to bankruptcy proceedings and bank restructurings, as he has now demonstrated in the most concrete possible way. Not the debt capacity. Debt capacity expands and contracts with market conditions and lender confidence, as he has also demonstrated. But the name, Trump, 5 letters, a word that in the American popular consciousness has come to connote a particular idea of wealth and ambition and New York, and the kind of maximalism that the 1980s both produced and celebrated. The name persists. It persists through the bankruptcies. It persists through the divorce. It persists through the headlines that are less flattering than the ones he once received. This is the insight that shapes the entire trajectory of the 1990s for Donald Trump, and it is an insight of genuine commercial brilliance. If the name is the asset, and the name can be deployed without the capital-intensive, debt-laden, operationally complex business of actually owning and developing real estate, then the path forward is not to rebuild the empire of owned properties that collapsed under the weight of its own leverage. The path forward is to license the name, to sell the right to attach those 5 letters to buildings, to products, to enterprises of various kinds, and to collect the financial benefit of that attachment without carrying the risk that ownership entails. Brand licensing is not a new concept in 1992. It is a well-established practice in the consumer goods industry, where companies routinely license their trademarks to manufacturers in exchange for royalties. But in real estate development, it is a relatively novel approach, the idea that a developer's name could function as a brand asset, licensable to other developers who would pay for the credibility and the marketing advantage that the famous name provides, is not yet a standard part of the industry's vocabulary. Trump makes it standard. Or rather, he makes it standard for himself, and in doing so, he establishes a model that will be widely imitated in the decades that follow. The arrangement is elegant in its simplicity. A developer, usually one with capital and local market knowledge, but without a nationally recognized brand, approaches the Trump organization seeking to license the Trump name for their project. In exchange for a licensing fee and a royalty on sales or revenues, the project gets to call itself Trump something, Trump International, Trump World, Trump Place, and to market itself with the full weight of the Trump brand's associations. Trump himself provides varying degrees of involvement in the project's design and marketing, lending his personal visibility and his real estate credibility to the enterprise. But the capital risk, the debt burden, the operational complexity, all of that belongs to the licensee. It is, from Trump's perspective, close to an ideal business model for the moment he finds himself in. The income is real. The risk is minimal. The brand is maintained and even enhanced, because each new Trump-branded property that opens successfully adds to the name's associations with luxury and quality, and each adds to the geographic reach of the brand's recognition. He is building an empire of a new kind. Not an empire of owned assets, but an empire of affiliated associations, a network of properties around the world that bear his name and pay for the privilege. The financial recovery that this model enables is gradual, but genuine. By the mid-1990s, the Trump organization's balance sheet is improving. The most acute pressures of the early decade restructurings are receding, and Trump is beginning to operate with something approaching the freedom of action he once took for granted. He acquires properties again, selectively, more carefully than in the 1980s, with a greater attention to the debt structures, and a less absolute confidence in his own ability to outrun any financial model's assumptions. He is not chastened in any spiritual sense. There is no public acknowledgement of error, no memoir of financial humility, no press conference at which he reflects on the lessons of leverage. But in the actual mechanics of how he structures his deals, there is evidence of learning. The 1990s also bring a significant evolution in Trump's relationship with popular culture, and this evolution is as important to understanding the decade as any business development. The bankruptcies and the divorce and the tabloid years have not diminished his celebrity. They have, in a paradox that says something interesting about the nature of American fame, intensified it. He is more famous in 1995 than he was in 1989, in the sense that more people know his name and recognize his face, even if what they know and recognize is more complicated and more contested than what the 1980s offered. He has become a character, a recurring figure in the American cultural imagination, a shorthand for a certain idea of wealth and excess, and the particular combination of vulgarity and grandeur that the country simultaneously mocks and secretly admires. He appears in films and television programs with an ease that suggests he has always understood, at some level, that the boundary between business and entertainment is more permeable than the conventional wisdom of either world acknowledges. He makes cameos, in Home Alone 2, on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, in a succession of films and television productions that want the shorthand legibility of his presence, the instant cultural notation that his appearance in a scene provides. He is, in the language of semiotics, a sign, a figure whose mere appearance communicates a dense package of associations without the need for any explanatory apparatus. Directors and writers and producers understand this and use it, and Trump, who has always understood that visibility is a form of capital, cooperates with evident pleasure. He also begins, in this decade, to think seriously about politics for the first time. The thinking is not entirely new. There have been murmurings and rumors and occasional public statements across the 1980s suggesting that Trump harbored political ambitions of some kind. And these murmurings were treated in the press and in political circles as the vanity projects of a rich man with too much confidence and too little experience of actual governance. But in the 1990s, the thinking becomes more sustained and more specific, and it begins to find expression in forms that go beyond the casual interview comment. In 1987, Trump had taken out full-page advertisements in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, paying for the space himself to publish an open letter criticizing American foreign policy, specifically the United States' practice of defending wealthy allies who were, in Trump's view, not contributing adequately to their own defense. The advertisements attracted attention and revealed an instinct that was, even then, recognizable as the instinct of a man thinking about a public role beyond real estate. The issues he raised, trade imbalances, the cost of American military commitments abroad, the question of whether other nations were taking advantage of American generosity and American power, were not the conventional concerns of a New York real estate developer. They were the concerns of someone whose reading and whose thinking had brought him to a place where the largest questions of national policy felt personally relevant and personally urgent. In 1999, Trump takes his most concrete political step yet, announcing an exploratory committee for the presidential election of 2000 under the banner of the Reform Party, the third party that Ross Perot had founded in the mid-1990s, and that had achieved sufficient electoral significance to provide, at least in theory, a platform for a serious independent candidacy. The Reform Party of 1999 is a complicated and somewhat chaotic organization, riven by internal disputes about its direction and its identity, and Trump's engagement with it is, in retrospect, more exploratory than serious, a toe in the water rather than a full commitment. But the issues he articulates in this brief foray into national politics are striking in their consistency with what he will say with far greater consequence 15 years later. He talks about trade. He talks about the deals that the United States makes with other countries, and whether those deals are good for American workers. He talks about the competence, or the lack thereof, of the political class that has been managing American affairs, the professional politicians, the career diplomats, the Washington establishment, that has, in his telling, allowed the country's economic position to deteriorate while congratulating itself on its own sophistication. He is skeptical of foreign entanglements. He is skeptical of the consensus positions that Democrats and Republicans alike hold on the questions of globalization and free trade, and the proper role of American power in the world. He withdraws from the Reform Party race in February of 2000, citing the party's internal disarray and the presence of figures he finds objectionable within its coalition. The withdrawal is graceful, as withdrawals go. He leaves without the kind of acrimony that would foreclose future possibilities, and he frames his departure in terms that suggest the decision is about the vehicle rather than the destination. The destination, it is now clear to anyone paying close attention, remains fixed in his imagination. He has tasted the attention that political pronouncements generate, the particular quality of public engagement that attaches to a man who is speaking about the largest questions of national life rather than the latest real estate transaction, and the taste has not diminished his appetite. It has, if anything, sharpened it. The decade closes with Donald Trump in a position that would have seemed, to anyone surveying his situation in 1991 or 1992, almost implausibly recovered. The bankruptcies are in the past, legally resolved, financially absorbed, psychologically processed, and filed away in the part of his mind reserved for adversities that have been overcome rather than adversities that have defined. The brand is not merely intact but in certain respects stronger, purified by the difficulties, into something leaner and more focused, a name that has proved its resilience by surviving conditions that would have permanently destroyed lesser names. The licensing model is generating revenues. New properties are being developed and managed under his supervision. The Atlantic City casinos continue to operate under his brand. He is also, in 1993, the father of a fourth child. Marla Maples has given birth to Tiffany Trump in October of that year, and Trump is, by the accounts of those around him, genuinely proud of his growing family, even as the marriage to Maples is already beginning to show the strain that will produce its own divorce in 1999. He enters the new millennium as something genuinely unusual in the American cultural landscape, a man who has been famous for 20 years, who has been celebrated and mocked and analyzed and caricatured, who has failed spectacularly in ways that were entirely public, who has recovered with a stubbornness that even his critics find remarkable, and who carries within him, still burning with the same intensity it has always carried, an ambition whose ultimate destination has not yet been reached. The 1990s have taught him things that the 1980s could not, the things that can only be learned by losing, by restructuring, by sitting across a table from bankers who hold your financial life in their hands and negotiating your way back from the edge. They have taught him something about resilience that no business school curriculum includes, because it cannot be taught, it can only be lived. He has lived it. He has survived it. And survival, for Donald Trump, has never been the end of the story. It has always been the beginning of the next one. Chapter 6. The Reality TV Revolution, 2000 to 2010. There is a moment in the history of American television that arrives in retrospect with the clarity of an inevitability. A moment when the medium, restless and perpetually hungry for the next form, the next format, the next way of holding the attention of a nation that has always had a complicated relationship with its own reflection, discovers something new. Not new in the way that color television was new, or cable was new, or the remote control was new. Technological novelties that changed the experience of watching without changing what was being watched. New in a deeper sense. New in the sense that the thing being watched is, for the first time, not a story invented by writers and performed by actors, but something that presents itself as the unmediated texture of actual life, actual people, actual decisions, actual consequences, the drama of existence itself, captured and edited and broadcast into the living rooms of America. Reality television, by the turn of the millennium, is not entirely new. The genre has been developing across the 1990s in various forms. The documentary-style programs, the competition formats imported from European television, the dating shows, and the survival programs that begin to proliferate across the cable landscape. But it is in the early years of the new decade that reality television achieves something like cultural dominance, when it moves from the periphery of the schedule to its center, when the broadcast networks, facing the twin pressures of rising scripted production costs and fragmenting audiences, discover that unscripted programming can deliver ratings at a fraction of the price, and when America, for reasons that are themselves worth examining, discovers that it cannot look away. Into this landscape, in January of 2004, walks Donald Trump. The Apprentice, created by the television producer Mark Burnett, the British-born impresario who had already demonstrated his mastery of the reality format with Survivor, is, in its conception, a simple and elegant idea. 16 candidates, drawn from the world of business and ambition, compete across a series of tasks for the ultimate prize, a job working for Donald Trump. Each episode ends in a boardroom scene in which Trump evaluates the performance of the competing teams, identifies the weakest contributor, and delivers a verdict with 3 words that will, within weeks of the show's premiere, become the most recognized phrase in American popular culture. "You're fired." The phrase is, in isolation, entirely unremarkable. It describes an event that happens every day in workplaces across the country, an event that is generally experienced as one of the more unpleasant of human interactions, freighted with embarrassment and anxiety, and the particular humiliation of public failure. But in the context that Mark Burnett and Donald Trump construct around it, the dramatic music, the imposing boardroom, the long table and the leather chairs and the Manhattan skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the moment of deliberate silence before the verdict, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes theater. It becomes the cathartic culmination of an hour of narrative tension, the moment of judgment that the audience has been anticipating and dreading and hoping for simultaneously. It becomes, in the vocabulary of television, a franchise. The Apprentice premieres on NBC on January 8, 2004, and the ratings are, by any measure, extraordinary. More than 20 million people watched the first episode. The reviews are enthusiastic. The cultural conversation that follows, the water cooler discussions the newspaper analyzes, the television critics attempting to account for the show's appeal, circles around a question that is simultaneously simple and genuinely interesting. Why does this work? Why does Donald Trump, specifically, work as the center of this particular format? The answers that emerge are illuminating. Trump works in this context because he is already a character, a fully formed, nationally recognized figure who arrives on screen carrying 20 years of public mythology with him. The audience does not need to be told who he is or what he represents. They already know. They know about the towers and the casinos, and the bankruptcies and the comeback and the art of the deal and the tabloid years. He comes pre-loaded with associations, with success and excess and New York, and the particular American idea that a sufficiently determined person can construct from will and intelligence and appetite a life of extraordinary scale. He does not need to be introduced. He needs only to be deployed. He is also, it becomes apparent almost immediately, a natural television performer in ways that surprise people who have known him primarily through print or brief broadcast appearances. He has an instinct for the camera that is partly innate and partly the product of 20 years of media management, an understanding of where the lens is and how to use it, of when to project authority and when to project warmth, of how to time a pause for maximum dramatic effect. He is comfortable with silence in a way that many people are not. And silence on television is one of the most powerful tools available. It creates tension, it implies deliberation. It suggests that the person sitting in it is in command of the room rather than at the mercy of it. The boardroom scenes are the engine of the show, and Trump presides over them with a combination of genuine business insight and theatrical instinct that reflects more accurately than most of his critics are willing to acknowledge his actual management style across decades of real estate development. He asks questions that cut to the essentials. He identifies the moment when a candidate's explanation is becoming an evasion. He delivers criticism that is direct to the point of bluntness, and he delivers it without the apologetic softening that the culture of corporate human resources had by the early 2000s come to expect. When he says you're fired, he means it, and the directness, the absence of the institutional cushioning that normally wraps the act of termination in euphemism and process, is part of the show's appeal. It is a fantasy of clarity in a world that has become, in the view of many of its inhabitants, excessively managed and insufficiently honest. The Apprentice runs for 14 seasons across its various iterations, including The Celebrity Apprentice, which begins in 2008 and brings a different and in some ways more revealing dynamic to the format. Celebrities, famous in their own right, and therefore less purely dependent on Trump's approval for their identities, competing for charity rather than employment, creating a social chemistry in the boardroom that is simultaneously more relaxed and more unpredictable. The celebrity version extends the show's cultural reach into demographics and conversations that the original format had not fully penetrated, and it keeps Trump's face and voice in the center of American popular culture for years beyond the point at which the original format might otherwise have exhausted its novelty. The financial dimensions of The Apprentice's success are significant, but they are secondary to the cultural dimensions. Trump's salary from the show is substantial, reportedly in the neighborhood of $1 million per episode in its peak years, and the income provides a steady and reliable revenue stream that is qualitatively different from the boom and bust character of real estate development. But the money, as important as it is during a period of financial reconstruction, is not the most consequential thing the show provides. The most consequential thing the show provides is a rewriting of the public narrative. The story that the 1990s told about Donald Trump, the story of the bankruptcies, the over-leveraged empire, the man who borrowed too much and lost too much and emerged diminished from the wreckage, that story does not disappear. But it is overlaid week by week and season by season with a new story. The new story is the one that The Apprentice tells. A story of a man who sits at the top of a global business empire, who commands a boardroom with effortless authority, who has seen enough of the world and enough of human nature to identify, in the space of an hour's observation, who has what it takes and who does not. It is a story of mastery. And mastery, projected at sufficient volume and with sufficient consistency into the living rooms of 20 million Americans every week, eventually becomes the dominant version of the truth. This is not to say that the narrative Trump constructs through the show is purely fictional. The business acumen is real. The instincts about people are real. The understanding of what makes a deal and what breaks it, what constitutes genuine leadership and what constitutes its convincing simulation, is grounded in decades of actual experience. But the specific image of Trump as the unquestioned sovereign of a vast and perfectly functioning empire, the image that the show's opening sequence with its helicopters and skyscrapers and the driving pulse of the theme music projects with such confident authority, is a construction. It is a very skillfully managed construction, built from real materials but assembled into a shape that serves a purpose beyond mere documentation. The purpose it serves, beyond the immediate commercial purpose of the television show itself, is the rehabilitation and expansion of the Trump brand in ways that have direct and measurable consequences for the licensing business that is, throughout this decade, the primary engine of the Trump Organization's revenue growth. The global expansion of the Trump name across the 2000s is, by any objective measure, extraordinary in its scope and its ambition. Trump-branded properties appear in cities across the United States, in Chicago, in Las Vegas, in Honolulu, and in international markets ranging from Toronto to Panama City to Istanbul to the Philippines. The licensing model that Trump developed in the 1990s as a survival strategy has, in the context of The Apprentice's cultural saturation, become an offensive weapon, a tool not merely for preserving value, but for generating it at a scale and a speed that outpaces anything the owned property model could produce. In Chicago, the Trump International Hotel and Tower rises to 98 stories on the north bank of the Chicago River, its glass facade catching the light of Lake Michigan, its presence in the Skyline, asserting the Trump brand in a city that is, in its own right, one of the great architectural capitals of the world. The Chicago Tower is one of the tallest buildings in the Western Hemisphere at the time of its completion in 2009, and it is, in the tradition of all Trump buildings, designed to be noticed, to announce itself against the Chicago skyline with the confidence of something that knows it belongs there. In Las Vegas, the Trump International Hotel rises on the Strip, or more precisely, just off the Strip on Fashion Show Drive, which is a distinction that matters in Las Vegas real estate even if it is invisible to most visitors. The Las Vegas Tower is a non-gaming hotel, which is itself a statement. Trump in Las Vegas without a casino, in a city whose identity is entirely constructed around gambling, is Trump making the argument that his brand is strong enough to draw guests who are not there for the tables, who are there specifically for the experience of staying in a Trump property. It is a bet on the brand's independent drawing power, and it is, by the metrics of occupancy and average daily rate, a bet that largely pays off. Internationally, the expansion is even more dramatic in its geography. Trump-branded towers go up in markets across Latin America, in Asian cities in the Middle East, in the former Soviet sphere, in places where the Trump name, amplified by The Apprentice's international syndication and by the global reach of American popular culture generally, carries the same aspirational associations that it carries in New York and Chicago and Las Vegas, transposed into local real estate markets where the demand for internationally branded luxury is intense and the supply is limited. The licensing arrangements that underpin this expansion are carefully constructed to protect Trump from the capital risks and the operational complexities that brought him to grief in the 1980s. He is, in most cases, not building these towers. He is not borrowing the money to build them. He is not guaranteeing their debt or managing their day-to-day operations. He is licensing his name, providing design consultation, maintaining brand standards, and collecting fees. The developers who build under his brand carry the risk. Trump carries the upside, the fees, the royalties, the brand enhancement that each new successful property provides. The decade is also marked in ways that will prove consequential by Trump's growing mastery of media in forms beyond television. He is an early and enthusiastic adopter of the media strategies that the cable news era makes available. The willingness to call into programs rather than requiring a formal interview setup, the cultivation of relationships with producers and hosts across the political and entertainment spectrum, the understanding that the media, in the cable era, has an insatiable appetite for content, and that a person willing to provide content reliably and colorfully will always have access. He appears on Howard Stern's radio program with a frequency and an openness that is, for a businessman of his profile, unusual, talking about women, about his personal life, about the details of his romantic history with a candor that shocks some observers and delights others, and that reveals, in its way, a man who has calculated correctly that the audience for frank conversation about the things that powerful men usually discuss only in private is large and loyal and genuinely appreciative of the absence of pretense. He cultivates relationships with the reporters and editors of the New York tabloids in ways that are simultaneously transactional and personal, providing tips, granting access, making himself available for the kind of ongoing relationship that produces favorable coverage, not through any single act of reciprocity, but through the accumulated goodwill of a sustained engagement. He understands with an instinctive precision that no media consultant has taught him that journalists are in the business of stories, and that a person who reliably provides good stories, dramatic stories, surprising stories, stories with clear protagonists and clear stakes, will be covered differently than a person who provides press releases. By the middle of the decade, Trump is managing his media presence with a sophistication that goes beyond anything his 1980s self would have recognized. He is not merely reacting to coverage. He is generating it, shaping it, using it as a business tool with the same deliberateness that he uses architectural design or debt structuring. He has understood something about the media of the early 21st century that many of his contemporaries in business and politics have not yet grasped, that in a media environment defined by fragmentation and competition for attention, the scarcest and most valuable commodity is not money or access or expertise. It is personality. It is the willingness to be vivid, to be specific, to be quotable, to occupy space in the public conversation with sufficient force and consistency that your absence would be felt. He is never absent. He makes certain of it. The decade brings personal changes as well. His marriage to Marla Maples ends in 1999, and in 2005 he marries Melania Knauss, a Slovenian-born model whom he met in 1998 at a party during New York Fashion Week. Melania Trump is, in the vocabulary of the New York social world that has been observing Donald Trump's personal life for 2 decades, a different kind of presence than her predecessors, more reserved, more private, more deliberately controlled in her public presentation. She has a specific elegance that is her own rather than a reflection of his, and the marriage, conducted at Mar-a-Lago in January of 2005, in a ceremony that is simultaneously a social event of the first order and a media production of considerable sophistication, suggests a domestic equilibrium that the more turbulent previous chapters of his personal life had not provided. Their son Barron is born in March of 2006, completing a family constellation that now spans across Trump's 3 marriages, 5 children of markedly different ages and markedly different relationships with their famous father, Donald Jr. and Ivanka and Eric, the 3 eldest, increasingly involved in the Trump Organization's operations and increasingly visible as extensions of the brand, Tiffany, younger and more distant from the business, and Barron, the youngest, growing up in the triplex apartment at the top of the building that started it all. The decade ends with Donald Trump in a position of cultural centrality that is, by the metrics of name recognition and media presence, arguably greater than at any previous point in his life. The Apprentice has been running for 6 years. The brand is global. The financial recovery from the 1990s is complete, and then some. The net worth, disputed and disputable as it always is, has returned to the billions by any reasonable calculation. He is, in the American imagination of 2010, something very specific and very fixed: the businessman, the dealmaker, the man who built the towers and survived the fall and came back on television to tell the country week after week what it takes to succeed. He is also, though this is not yet fully visible to the public, or perhaps fully formed in his own consciousness, something else. He is a man who has spent the decade watching the political world with increasing attention and increasing impatience, watching the elections, watching the debates, watching the men and women who seek and hold the highest offices in the land, and measuring them with the particular measuring instrument of someone who has spent 40 years evaluating the quality of the people in his boardroom against a standard that he finds more often than not wanting. He has things to say about how the country is being run. He has been saying some of them for years in interviews and in the margins of his public appearances, and the people who have been listening have noticed a consistency of theme and a specificity of grievance that goes beyond the casual political commentary of the celebrity class. He is not performing political engagement. He is, in some genuine and deepening sense, politically engaged, frustrated, specifically and articulately frustrated, in ways that are beginning to find expression in forms that go beyond the interview comment or the newspaper advertisement. The next chapter of the story is not yet written as the decade closes. But the pen is in his hand. And the page, as it always has been, is blank and waiting. He has never been afraid of a blank page. He has always known exactly what to put on it. Chapter 7. The Road to the White House, 2011 to 2016. There is a particular kind of political emergence that historians, looking back, tend to describe as inevitable. A convergence of person and moment so complete, so mutually reinforcing, that the outcome seems, in retrospect, to have been written into the logic of events long before the events themselves unfolded. The candidate was exactly right for the time. The time was exactly right for the candidate. The fit was so precise that it is difficult afterward to imagine the story ending any other way. This is, of course, an illusion produced by hindsight. Nothing in politics is inevitable before it happens, and the story of Donald Trump's path to the presidency of the United States is, at every stage of its unfolding, far more contingent and far more surprising than the retrospective narrative of inevitability suggests. There are moments along the way, dozens of them, scores of them, at which the story could have ended differently. At which a different decision, a different statement, a different response to a different provocation could have sent the trajectory elsewhere. The fact that it ends where it ends, on the stage of the Hilton Midtown in New York City, in the early hours of November 9, 2016, with a result that stuns the world, is not the product of historical necessity. It is the product of a specific human being, in a specific historical moment, making specific choices, and of a country that was, in ways that most of its most credentialed observers had failed entirely to perceive, ready for exactly this. The story of the road to the White House begins, in the most proximate sense, in 2011, at a dinner in Washington that will become one of the most analyzed evenings in modern American political history. The White House Correspondents' Association dinner is an annual ritual of Washington's particular species of self-congratulation, a formal event at which the President of the United States, the press corps that covers the White House, and a selection of celebrities and public figures gather in a ballroom at the Washington Hilton to eat indifferent food, applaud each other's importance, and listen to jokes that are, depending on the year and the comedian, either genuinely funny or merely obligatory. It is, in essence, a celebration of the Washington establishment by the Washington establishment, conducted in the full awareness that the rest of the country is watching, and in the comfortable assumption that the rest of the country is, at some level, impressed. Donald Trump is in the room on the evening of April 30, 2011. He is there as a guest, seated in the audience, and his presence has a specific context. He has, over the preceding weeks and months, been one of the most prominent voices in a public campaign, demanding that President Barack Obama release his original birth certificate, the long-form document from Hawaii that would, in Trump's repeated and public insistence, definitively resolve questions about the president's birthplace and his eligibility for the office he holds. The birther controversy, the set of claims and suspicions and persistent questions about Obama's birth, his citizenship, his fundamental American identity, has been circulating in various forms since the 2008 campaign. It has been dismissed, repeatedly and with evidence by fact-checkers and journalists and the state of Hawaii itself. Obama has released his short-form birth certificate. The Hawaiian Health Department has confirmed its authenticity. The contemporaneous newspaper birth announcements from 1961 have been located and published. By any evidentiary standard that a reasonable person might apply, the question has been answered. But Trump, in early 2011, elevates the issue to a different level of visibility. He raises it on television, repeatedly and insistently, with the particular combination of insinuation and apparent sincerity that is his rhetorical signature, not asserting that Obama was definitely born elsewhere, but questioning persistently why the documentation is not more forthcoming, why the question has not been more definitively put to rest, why so many people seem to have so many unanswered questions. He calls for the release of the long-form certificate. He implies that what it might contain could be surprising. He keeps the story alive in the media ecosystem simply by being willing to say things about it that most public figures of his prominence are not willing to say. In April of 2011, the White House releases the long-form birth certificate. Obama addresses the press in the White House briefing room with a tone of weary exasperation, noting that he has more important things to attend to and that he hopes the release will put the matter to rest. Trump, appearing before cameras in New Hampshire on the same day, takes credit for the release and expresses satisfaction. The episode is, by the accounting of the mainstream press, a defeat for Trump. The document he demanded has been produced. The claim he amplified has been refuted, and he has been exposed as the promoter of a conspiracy theory that the evidence does not support. This accounting, while not unreasonable, misses something important. It misses the audience that has been watching Trump pursue this issue, and that has not drawn the same conclusion from the same evidence. It misses the segment of the American public for whom the persistence of the question, regardless of what any particular document says, reflects something real and felt about a president they do not trust and a political establishment they do not believe. Trump has not been speaking to the press corps when he raises the birther issue. He has been speaking to a different audience entirely, and that audience's relationship with the episode is not the same as the press corps' relationship with it. The White House Correspondents' Dinner, 2 weeks after the birth certificate release, is the establishment's response to Trump's months of prominence, and it is delivered by two men, Seth Meyers, the comedian serving as the evening's host, and Barack Obama himself. Both devote substantial portions of their remarks to Trump, who is seated in the audience and visible to the cameras that are tracking his reactions. The jokes are pointed. Obama describes Trump's qualifications for the presidency with a dry mockery that draws extended laughter from the ballroom. Meyers goes further, with a specificity and a sustained focus that goes beyond the conventional roast and into something closer to ridicule. Trump sits through it. His expression, captured by the cameras and analyzed by commentators for years afterward, is difficult to read precisely, a studied composure that may contain any number of things beneath its surface. He does not laugh. He does not visibly react with anger. He sits and he absorbs and he leaves, and he does not say anything publicly about the evening that reveals what it cost him to sit in that room. What it produces in him is a matter of speculation, and Trump himself has given different accounts at different times. But what becomes clear in the months and years that follow is that the evening at the Washington Hilton does not diminish his interest in politics. It intensifies it. The man who sat in that ballroom and was made the object of the establishment's most concentrated mockery does not retreat from public life. He does not conclude that the political world is too humiliating or too hostile to pursue. He draws a different conclusion, one that is, in its way, entirely consistent with everything that is known about how Donald Trump processes adversity. He concludes that the establishment has made a mistake, that they have underestimated him, that the laughter in that ballroom represents not the sound of a threat being neutralized, but the sound of a class of people who have confused their own comfort with the country's condition, and who will discover in time the cost of that confusion. He does not announce a presidential campaign in 2012. The timing is not right. Obama's incumbency is strong. The Republican field is already established, and Trump's political infrastructure, such as it is not ready for a serious run. He watches the 2012 election with the attention of a man studying a game he intends to play, noting the candidates, the strategies, the messaging, the ways in which the Republican Party of 2012 both connects with and fails to connect with the electorate it needs to win. He observes the Republican establishment's post-2012 autopsy, the formal analysis commissioned by the Republican National Committee that concludes the party needs to broaden its coalition, to soften its positions on immigration, to appeal to the growing Latino electorate that voted overwhelmingly for Obama. He reads it, or absorbs its conclusions through the media coverage it generates, and he reaches a conclusion about it that is the precise opposite of the one the authors intend. He concludes that the diagnosis is wrong. That the party's problem is not that it has been too hard on immigration, but that it has been too timid in its overall approach, too managed, too consultant-driven, too focused on winning the approval of an electorate it should instead be leading. The years between 2012 and 2015 are years of preparation that are not publicly visible as preparation. Trump is still hosting The Apprentice. He is still managing the brand licensing business. He is still making his media appearances, still calling into the cable news programs, still maintaining the drumbeat of presence in the public conversation that is his most consistent practice. But he is also doing something else. He is thinking. He is developing the political philosophy, if philosophy is the right word for what is more accurately described as a set of visceral convictions about the country's direction and its leadership, that will become the foundation of his campaign. The convictions are not complicated, and their lack of complication is, it will turn out, a feature rather than a limitation. America is being taken advantage of by other countries. The trade deals that the political class has negotiated are bad deals, bad for American workers, bad for American manufacturing, bad for the communities that have been hollowed out by the movement of jobs to Mexico and China and elsewhere. The people who have negotiated these deals are either incompetent or captured by interests that are not the interests of ordinary Americans. The politicians who have allowed the country's borders to be effectively open are either similarly incompetent or similarly captured. Washington is broken, and the people who have broken it are the people who run it. The career politicians, the lobbyists, the donors, the consultants, the entire apparatus of professional politics that has been managing the country's decline while calling it progress. These convictions connect to something that is running very deep in the American electorate of 2015, something that the polling data is beginning to register, but that the political establishment is not reading correctly. The economic recovery from the 2008 financial crisis has been real in the aggregate statistics, and largely invisible in the lived experience of the working class and middle class Americans, whose wages have stagnated, whose communities have not recovered, whose sense of the future is darker than their parents' sense of the future was. The opioid epidemic is ravaging specific communities with a specific demographic profile. The manufacturing sector, which once provided the economic foundation for an entire American working class, has contracted in ways that feel, in the communities most affected, not like the natural evolution of an economy but like a betrayal. Into this landscape, on June 16, 2015, Donald Trump descends an escalator in Trump Tower and announces his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The announcement itself is a production. Of course it is, staged in the atrium of the building that has served for 30 years as the most visible monument to its owner's ambitions. The crowd assembled in the lobby includes supporters and curious onlookers, and it will later be reported, some people who were paid to attend and provide the atmosphere of a packed and enthusiastic room. The speech that Trump delivers is long, discursive, specific in some places and vague in others, and it contains, near its beginning, a passage about immigration from Mexico that generates an immediate and enormous controversy. The passage describes people crossing the border from Mexico as including, among others, criminals and rapists. It is not a carefully qualified statement. It is not hedged with the kind of diplomatic language that political campaigns typically employ when discussing sensitive topics. It is blunt and it is inflammatory, and it produces exactly the response that blunt and inflammatory statements produce in the media environment of 2015. It dominates the coverage. It generates intense criticism from Democrats and from many Republicans. It results in the termination of business relationships with companies that have been licensing the Trump name for various commercial purposes. and it establishes from the very first day of the campaign that this candidacy will not be conducted according to the rules that previous candidacies have followed. The political establishment. And here it is important to understand that the political establishment includes not only Democrats, but the bulk of the Republican Party's professional apparatus, treats the announcement with a mixture of amusement and contempt that closely mirrors the response of the Washington Hilton Ballroom 4 years earlier. Trump is not a serious candidate. He is a celebrity seeking attention. He will say outrageous things, generate press coverage, poll in the mid-single digits for a few months, and withdraw before any actual votes are cast. This is the consensus view, stated with varying degrees of explicitness by varying degrees of authority, and it is held with the confidence of people who believe that their long experience of how campaigns work gives them reliable insight into how this one will work. The consensus is wrong at every stage of its prediction. Trump does not poll in the mid-single digits. He shoots to the top of the Republican primary polls within weeks of his announcement, and stays there, not consistently, not without fluctuation, but with a persistence and a durability that the consensus view cannot explain and does not know how to accommodate. He is leading the field. Month after month, as the summer of 2015 becomes the fall and the fall becomes the winter and the primary season approaches, he is leading the field. The campaign he runs is unlike any presidential campaign in the modern era. It is run on the logic of the rally. Enormous events in arenas and convention centers and airplane hangars across the country, drawing crowds of 10 and 15 and 20,000 people who stand for hours to hear a man speak without a teleprompter about the things that are making them angry. The anger is real, and it is specific, and it is felt, and Trump speaks to it with a directness and an energy that the scripted, polished, message-disciplined candidates arrayed against him in the Republican field cannot match. He is not reading from talking points. He is talking, actually talking, in the register of genuine conversation rather than political performance, about the things he thinks and the things he believes and the things he would do if given the chance to do them. He is also, throughout the campaign, engaged in a running battle with the media that is itself a major subplot of the political story. He attacks specific journalists and specific outlets with a specificity and a ferocity that no major party presidential candidate has ever deployed. He calls the press dishonest, fake in the terminology he is beginning to develop and refine. He mocks reporters at his rallies, directing the crowd's attention to the press pen and inviting a response that is, depending on the rally and the moment, somewhere between theatrical contempt and genuine hostility. The press covers these attacks extensively, which is precisely what Trump intends. Each story about his attacks on the media is a story that reaches his base and confirms what they already believe about the institutions that cover him. The Republican primary field is, by historical standards, unusually strong. 17 candidates at its peak, including sitting governors, sitting senators, former governors, a former CEO, and a former neurosurgeon of international renown. It is, the Republican establishment assures itself, the deepest and most talented field the party has assembled in decades. Surely one of these capable, experienced, credentialed men and women will find the message and the moment to stop the reality television star from New York, who has never held elected office, and whose positions on a range of policy questions are, at best, inconsistently defined. One by one they fail. Rick Perry goes first, unable to sustain a campaign that never achieves ignition. Scott Walker, once considered the establishment's strongest hope, withdraws in September of 2015. His campaign evaporated by a combination of poor debate performances and the simple fact that in a field dominated by Trump's gravitational pull, a candidate without a distinctive identity has nowhere to stand. The summer of 2015 and the fall of 2015 and the winter of 2016 are a procession of withdrawals, each one confirming the same basic dynamic, that the normal tools of Republican primary politics, the endorsements, the donor networks, the super PACs, the carefully cultivated relationships with state party organizations, are not working against an opponent who is operating on entirely different principles. Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida and the early establishment favorite, raises and spends more money than any other Republican candidate and finishes the primary season, having demonstrated with expensive and exhaustive thoroughness that money cannot purchase authenticity, and that a candidate who is perceived as the embodiment of a political dynasty that a significant portion of the electorate has decided it is finished with cannot overcome that perception regardless of what his super PAC spends on television advertising. Trump dispatches him with a nickname, Low Energy Jeb, that is devastating not because it is true in any precise sense, but because it crystallizes a feeling that voters have about the candidate before they have fully articulated it to themselves. The nicknames are a significant feature of the Trump campaign. Little Marco for Marco Rubio, Lion Ted for Ted Cruz, Low Energy Jeb for Bush, and they are more sophisticated than they appear. Each one is designed to attach to a specific perceived vulnerability, to create a mental association that is difficult to dislodge once established, to reduce a multidimensional human being to a single defining characteristic that is also a disqualification. They are mean, and they are reductive, and they are remarkably effective. Ted Cruz is the last serious challenger, and the battle between Cruz and Trump in the late stages of the primary is fierce and personal, and conducted at a level of mutual hostility that produces statements from both men that their supporters in better times would prefer to forget. But Cruz, for all his tactical intelligence and his genuine ideological coherence, cannot solve the fundamental problem of the 2016 primary. He is a politician, in an election in which being a politician is itself disqualifying for the voters who are driving the outcome. Trump wins the Indiana primary in May of 2016. Cruz withdraws, and the Republican nomination, the nomination that the establishment insisted at every stage of its being won was not possible, belongs to Donald Trump. The general election campaign against Hillary Clinton is the most watched, the most discussed, the most analyzed, and arguably the most consequential presidential campaign in American history since 1980. Clinton is, by virtually every conventional metric, the stronger candidate, more experienced, more knowledgeable about policy, better organized, better funded, supported by the full institutional apparatus of the Democratic Party, and by a coalition of endorsements from political, cultural, and business figures that dwarfs anything Trump can assemble. She wins all three presidential debates by the judgment of the professional class, and by the instant post-debate polling of uncommitted voters. Trump wins the campaign. He wins it in the places where the campaign is actually decided, in the industrial Midwest, in the communities of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that have been voting Democratic in presidential elections for decades, and that deliver their electoral votes to Trump on November 8th by margins thin enough to be lost in a recount but real enough to be determinative. He wins it in Florida. He wins it in Iowa and Ohio. He assembles, against all the predictions of the models and the expectations of the analysts, the 270 electoral votes required to become the 45th President of the United States. The night of November 8, 2016, is experienced differently by different people, and the experience depends almost entirely on what they expected. For the people who predicted a Clinton victory, and they are, on that night, the overwhelming majority of the professional observers of American politics, the evening is a slow-motion catastrophe, the map filling with Trump red in places that the models said would stay blue, the electoral math that was supposed to be straightforward revealing itself, hour by hour, to be running in an entirely unexpected direction. There is, in the television studios and the Clinton campaign's glass-ceilinged headquarters in Manhattan, a quality of genuine disbelief, the expression of people who are certain of something and are watching their certainty dissolve in real time. For the people who have been attending the rallies, who have been standing in the airplane hangars and the arenas for hours to hear this man speak, who have felt for the duration of this campaign that something was happening that the people on television were not seeing and not understanding, for those people the night is a vindication. Not merely a political victory, but a confirmation that their sense of things was right, that the country they live in is not the country that the credentialed and the comfortable were describing, that the distance between what the experts said and what was actually happening was not a failure of the voters to understand their situation, but a failure of the experts to understand the country. At the New York Hilton Midtown, in the early hours of November 9, 2016, Donald Trump takes the stage to deliver his victory speech. He is 70 years old. He has never held elected office. He has never served in the military. He has declared corporate bankruptcy 4 times. He has been divorced twice and married 3 times. He has been mocked, and dismissed and underestimated at every stage of the journey that has brought him to this moment. He stands at the podium, and the crowd before him is enormous and ecstatic, and still not entirely certain that what has happened is real. He speaks, in the register that the occasion demands, about unity, about being the president of all Americans, about binding the wounds of a divided nation, about the work that lies ahead. It is, by the standards of his campaign, a restrained and gracious speech, and it reveals something that the campaign has sometimes obscured, that the man who will walk into the Oval Office in January is not simply the sum of his provocations and his controversies, but someone who understands in this particular moment the weight of what he has been given. The skyline of Manhattan is visible through the windows of the ballroom. It is a skyline that he has spent his entire adult life helping to shape, the buildings with his name on them, the towers that announced his arrival, and survived his setbacks and stood through everything the city and the market and the critics could deliver. He looks at none of this, or if he does not show it. He is looking forward, as he has always looked forward, toward the next thing, the largest thing, the thing that has no precedent in his experience, because there is nothing in the experience of any human being that quite prepares you for what he is about to become. He is about to become the President of the United States. And the story, the long, improbable, exhausting, exhilarating, infuriating, impossible story, is only just beginning its most consequential chapter. Chapter 8. The 45th Presidency, 2017 to 2021. The 20th of January 2017 arrives in Washington with a gray sky, and a cold that has the particular quality of a city bracing itself, the kind of cold that is not merely meteorological but atmospheric, a chill that seems to emanate from the moment itself rather than from the temperature. The National Mall is filling with people, hundreds of thousands of them, and the city that surrounds them is simultaneously festive and tense, decorated with the bunting of a democratic transition, and patrolled by a security presence of extraordinary density, the streets blocked and the airspace controlled, and the whole apparatus of American presidential succession deployed at full scale. On the steps of the United States Capitol, Donald John Trump places his left hand on two Bibles, one belonging to his family, one the Bible that Abraham Lincoln used at his own inauguration, raises his right hand, and repeats the 35 words that every president since George Washington has spoken at the threshold of the office. He swears to faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Chief Justice John Roberts administers the oath. Melania Trump stands beside her husband in a powder blue ensemble that the fashion press will analyze for days. The former presidents arrayed behind them, Carter, Clinton, Bush, observe with expressions that are professionally composed and personally unreadable. And then Donald Trump turns to the microphone and delivers the speech that his senior advisor Stephen Miller has helped him draft. And the Washington that has been waiting to hear the new president's first words as president hears something that lands in the room and in the country like a cold stone dropped into still water. The speech is short by inaugural standards, less than 17 minutes, and it is, in its imagery and its emotional register, unlike any inaugural address in the modern era. It does not speak of shared values and common purpose in the language of reconciliation that inaugurals typically employ. It speaks of carnage. American carnage. The phrase sits in the middle of the address like something deliberately placed, a declaration of the president's diagnosis of the country he is inheriting and the governing philosophy he intends to apply. The factories shuttered, and the communities ruined, and the wealth stripped away, and the politicians who allowed it all to happen, standing right there on that platform behind him, all of it summoned in language that is combative and specific and entirely inconsistent with the ceremonial register that the occasion is supposed to require. The former President George W. Bush, according to accounts that emerge in the days following, turns to someone near him after the speech and offers a 4-word assessment: that was some weird stuff. It is a verdict that captures, in its plain vernacular, the reaction of much of official Washington. The sense that something has happened that is outside the familiar grammar of American political transition, that the man who has just taken the oath is not going to play by the rules that everyone in that room has spent their careers observing and enforcing. He is not. And the 4 years that follow are, by any honest accounting, the most turbulent, the most contested, and the most consequential presidential term in American memory. The early days of the administration establish with remarkable speed the governing style that will define the entire term. Trump signs executive orders at a pace and with a theatrical deliberateness that is itself a form of communication. The signing ceremony, conducted in the Oval Office with cameras present and aides arrayed behind the president, and the order held up for inspection after the signature, becomes a signature production of the new administration. It signals action. It signals that, unlike its predecessors, this administration will not wait for congressional consensus before moving, will not allow the machinery of Washington deliberation to absorb its energy and produce months later a compromise that satisfies no one and changes nothing. The executive orders of the first weeks cover an extraordinary range. The construction of a wall along the southern border with Mexico is ordered. The travel ban, an executive order restricting entry to the United States from a list of predominantly Muslim countries that the administration identifies as presenting particular security risks, is signed on January 27, 1 week after inauguration, and produces an immediate and extraordinary response. Protests at airports across the country, legal challenges filed within hours in federal courts, and a judicial restraining order that blocks implementation and begins the first of many rounds of litigation that will define the administration's relationship with the federal judiciary. The travel ban controversy establishes, in its first days, the pattern of conflict that will recur throughout the term. An action taken by executive authority, challenged in the courts, relitigated through successive versions as previous versions are struck down or modified, ultimately arriving at the Supreme Court in a form that survives constitutional scrutiny but only after months of legal and political combat that consumes enormous administrative energy and generates enormous press coverage. It is a preview of the administration's relationship with the institutions of American governance. Relationships that are, from the first days, adversarial rather than cooperative, defined by confrontation rather than accommodation. The cabinet that Trump assembles for his first term is a collection of figures that reflects the various impulses and contradictions of the administration itself. Rex Tillerson, the former chief executive of ExxonMobil, becomes Secretary of State, a choice that signals a businessman's approach to diplomacy, the application of transactional logic to relationships that have traditionally been managed through the accumulated protocols of professional diplomacy. James Mattis, the retired Marine general widely revered in the national security community, becomes Secretary of Defense, a choice that reassures the establishment figures who worry about a commander-in-chief with no military experience. Steve Bannon, the former executive chairman of Breitbart News and the architect of much of the campaign's populist messaging, becomes chief strategist, a choice that signals the administration's intention to maintain its connection to the nationalist and populist energy that produced the election victory. These three figures, Tillerson, Mattis, Bannon, are themselves a microcosm of the tensions that will define the administration's internal life. The establishment figures who bring institutional credibility and professional experience are, from the beginning, in tension with the nationalist insurgents who believe that establishment credibility and professional experience are precisely the problem. Trump moves between these camps with a fluidity that sometimes looks like strategic flexibility and sometimes looks like the simple expression of whatever conversation he has most recently had. And the result is an administration that is, by the accounts of virtually everyone who serves in it, extraordinarily difficult to manage and extraordinarily unpredictable in its outputs. The departures begin almost immediately and continue throughout the term. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigns after 24 days, amid revelations about conversations with the Russian ambassador that he has misrepresented to Vice President Mike Pence. Press Secretary Sean Spicer, who begins his tenure with an argument about crowd size that becomes one of the most discussed moments of the early administration, departs in July of 2017. Bannon is out by August. Tillerson is fired by tweet in March of 2018. The medium of the dismissal itself, a statement about the administration's relationship with conventional protocol. Mattis resigns in December of 2018, submitting a letter that is remarkable for its directness in stating the philosophical differences that make his continued service untenable, citing specifically Trump's dismissal of the value of American alliances. The turnover in senior positions across the 4 years of the first term is, by historical comparison, without precedent in its scale and its pace. Chiefs of staff, national security advisors, secretaries of state and defense and homeland security, attorneys general, directors of national intelligence, they come and they go with a frequency that becomes for Washington's observer class a kind of ongoing narrative in itself. Each departure generates its own coverage, its own competing explanations, its own revealing details about the conditions inside an administration that is, by any institutional standard, deeply unusual. Against this backdrop of internal turbulence, the administration pursues its legislative agenda with a focus that is, at its best moments, genuinely effective. The signature legislative achievement of the first term is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the most comprehensive revision of the United States tax code since the Tax Reform Act of 1986, signed into law in December of 2017, after a legislative process that is, by the standards of major tax legislation, remarkably swift. The act reduces the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, a reduction of historic magnitude that proponents argue will unleash investment and economic growth by making American corporations more competitive globally, and that critics argue is a transfer of wealth to shareholders and executives at the expense of working Americans and the federal deficit. It reduces individual income tax rates across most brackets, nearly doubles the standard deduction, and significantly expands the child tax credit. It caps the deduction for state and local taxes at $10,000, a provision that is, in its political geography, a direct imposition on the high-tax blue states whose voters did not support Trump and whose congressional representatives are not in a position to stop it. The economic consequences of the act are, as is almost always the case with major tax legislation, disputed along partisan lines in ways that make objective assessment difficult. Corporate investment increases in the immediate aftermath of the legislation's passage. The stock market, already in a sustained bull run, continues its ascent. Unemployment falls to historic lows across multiple demographic categories, a development the administration promotes with justifiable enthusiasm. Critics point to the expanding federal deficit, to the concentration of benefits at the upper end of the income distribution, to the failure of the promised surge in business investment to materialize at the scale the legislation's advocates projected. What is not disputed is the political significance of the achievement. Tax reform is one of the hardest legislative tasks in American politics. The complexity of the code, the intensity of the competing interests, the sheer difficulty of constructing a majority coalition for any significant change, and the Trump administration accomplishes it in its first year with a Republican Congress that is frequently fractious and occasionally openly hostile to the president's leadership. It is a legislative achievement that his most vocal critics are reluctant to acknowledge, and that his most ardent supporters cite as central evidence of a presidency that, beneath the noise and the controversy, is delivering on its core commitments. The commitment that will prove most durably consequential, the one that will reshape American life in ways that extend far beyond any single administration and that will be debated and felt for generations, is the reshaping of the federal judiciary and most particularly the Supreme Court. The vacancy that awaits Trump on his first day in office is itself a product of one of the most consequential decisions in recent Senate history. Justice Antonin Scalia, the conservative intellectual titan of the court's right wing, dies in February of 2016, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announces within hours that the Senate will not consider President Obama's nominee to fill the vacancy, that the seat will remain open until the next president takes office, allowing the American people to weigh in on the court's direction through the election. The decision is constitutionally unprecedented and politically explosive, but McConnell holds his conference together through the election and into the transition, and Trump inherits a Supreme Court with a vacancy that is his to fill. He fills it with Neil Gorsuch, a federal appeals court judge from Colorado, whose judicial philosophy aligns with the originalist tradition that Scalia embodied, whose intellectual credentials are impeccable, and whose confirmation, after a brutal confirmation battle that includes the Senate's elimination of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations, gives the court its fifth conservative justice and fulfills the promise that Trump made to the evangelical and socially conservative voters who made his election possible. The second vacancy arrives in the summer of 2018, When Justice Anthony Kennedy, the court's swing vote for decades, the justice whose vote has been decisive in cases involving abortion rights, gay rights, and the limits of executive power, announces his retirement. The replacement of Kennedy, who was a moderate conservative, with Brett Kavanaugh, a more reliably conservative jurist, is itself a significant rightward shift in the court's balance. But the nomination becomes something more than a judicial appointment when Christine Blasey Ford, a California psychology professor, testifies before the Senate Judiciary Committee that Kavanaugh sexually assaulted her at a party when they were both in high school in the early 1980s. The Kavanaugh confirmation hearings are among the most watched and most emotionally charged political events of the decade. Ford's testimony is compelling, detailed, specific, delivered with a composure that strikes many observers as the composure of someone recounting something that actually happened. Kavanaugh's rebuttal is equally fierce, categorical in its denial, emotional in its expression, delivered with an anger that his supporters read as righteous indignation and his critics read as disqualifying temperament. The FBI conducts a supplemental investigation whose scope becomes its own source of controversy. The Senate confirms Kavanaugh by the narrowest margin of any successful Supreme Court nominee in the modern era, 50-48. The third vacancy arrives in September of 2020, when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the liberal icon, the feminist hero, the 87-year-old embodiment of the progressive legal tradition, dies of pancreatic cancer 18 days before a presidential election. The circumstances are a direct mirror image of the Scalia vacancy in 2016, and the question of whether the McConnell principle, that a Supreme Court vacancy in an election year should not be filled until after the election, will be applied symmetrically, produces a political controversy of enormous intensity. It is not applied symmetrically. McConnell moves with the same speed he deployed in 2016, this time in the opposite direction, pressing forward with the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, a federal appeals court judge from Indiana with impeccable conservative credentials and a personal biography, as a devout Catholic mother of 7, including 2 adopted children from Haiti, that is designed to speak directly to the constituency most invested in the court's direction on social issues. Barrett is confirmed on October 26, 2020, 8 days before the election, giving the court a 6-3 conservative majority that is the most significant reshaping of the court's ideological balance since the Warren Court of the 1950s and 1960s. The consequences of this reshaping will manifest most dramatically after the first term ends, but they are already visible in the court's decisions across the Trump years, in the rulings on the travel ban, on immigration enforcement, on religious liberty cases, on the scope of administrative authority. The court that Trump leaves behind is his most lasting institutional legacy, the one that will continue to render decisions and shape American law long after the specific controversies of his presidency have receded into historical memory. Running beneath and through all of these policy and judicial developments is the investigation that consumes more of the administration's political oxygen than any other single matter: the special counsel investigation led by Robert Mueller into Russian interference in the 2016 election and potential obstruction of justice by the president and his associates. The investigation begins in May of 2017, when Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appoints Mueller following the firing of FBI Director James Comey, a firing that Trump explains in a subsequent interview as connected to the Russia investigation, a statement that generates immediate discussion of whether the firing constitutes obstruction of justice. Mueller's investigation runs for nearly 2 years, employing a team of experienced prosecutors and investigators, issuing indictments and securing guilty pleas from a series of Trump associates, Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, Roger Stone, among others, on charges ranging from lying to federal investigators to financial fraud to conspiracy against the United States. The investigation is a constant presence in the political atmosphere of the administration's first 2 years, generating weekly revelations, producing competing narratives from the White House and the press about what the evidence means and where the inquiry is headed. Mueller delivers his report to Attorney General William Barr in March of 2019. The report's principal conclusions, that the investigation did not establish that the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government in its election interference activities, but that the evidence regarding obstruction of justice neither establishes nor exonerates the president, are immediately the subject of interpretive combat that produces little consensus and enormous heat. Trump declares total exoneration. Democrats argue that the report's obstruction findings, carefully read, describe conduct that would have produced charges against any person not protected by a Justice Department policy against indicting a sitting president. The argument continues, without resolution, through the remainder of the term. The first impeachment follows in December of 2019, arising from a phone call between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which Trump asks Zelensky to investigate the business activities of Hunter Biden, son of former Vice President Joe Biden, who is at this point the leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. The House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats following the 2018 midterm elections, impeaches Trump on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The Senate, controlled by Republicans, acquits him on both articles in February of 2020, with the vote on the abuse of power article producing the sole bipartisan result of the process. Utah Senator Mitt Romney votes to convict, becoming the first senator in American history to vote to remove a president of his own party. The policy record of the first term extends far beyond tax reform and judicial appointments, and it is, in its totality, both more substantive and more contested than the coverage of the administration's most dramatic moments might suggest. The renegotiation of NAFTA produces the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, a revised trade framework that the administration argues better protects American workers and manufacturers. The administration imposes tariffs on Chinese goods at a scale and with a persistence that marks a fundamental departure from the free trade consensus that has governed American trade policy for decades. A departure that generates immediate controversy but that reflects a view of the relationship between trade policy and American manufacturing that has, since Trump raised it, found adherents across the political spectrum. The Abraham Accords, brokered in 2020, under the diplomatic leadership of Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, normalize relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. A set of diplomatic achievements in the Middle East that breaks with the conventional wisdom about the preconditions for regional normalization, and that produces agreements that survive beyond the administration and continue to reshape the region's diplomatic landscape. The administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic, which arrives in the United States in force in the late winter and spring of 2020, becomes the defining event of the term's final year. The administration's early public messaging, the repeated reassurances in February and early March that the virus is under control, that the situation is not serious, that the number of cases will soon go to zero, is subsequently revealed by the journalist Bob Woodward's reporting to have occurred at a time when Trump privately acknowledged to Woodward that the virus was serious, deadly, and far more dangerous than the flu. The gap between the public statements and the private acknowledgments becomes a central element of the pandemic's political narrative. Operation Warp Speed, the public-private partnership the administration launches to accelerate the development and production of coronavirus vaccines, is, by contrast, a genuine and significant achievement, a mobilization of government resources and regulatory flexibility that produces in under a year multiple safe and effective vaccines against a novel pathogen, a timeline that experts had considered at the pandemic's outset almost impossibly optimistic. The vaccines begin distribution in December of 2020, a month after the election. The election of 2020 is held in the context of the pandemic, with a dramatic expansion of mail-in voting that both parties acknowledge has no precedent in modern American electoral history. Joe Biden, the former vice president, defeats Trump by a margin of 7 million votes in the popular vote and 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, the same Electoral College margin that Trump described as a landslide when he achieved it against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Trump does not concede. He contests the result in the courts, where more than 60 lawsuits challenging various aspects of the election are filed and almost universally dismissed for lack of evidence. In the public arena, where the claims of widespread fraud are amplified through social media and through the network of conservative media that has supported the administration. And in the political arena, where the pressure on Republican elected officials to support the challenges produces a set of responses ranging from quiet acquiescence to the open resistance of a small number of figures who insist publicly and at political cost that the election was conducted fairly and that the results are legitimate. The certification of the Electoral College results is scheduled for January 6, 2021, a joint session of Congress presided over by Vice President Mike Pence. On the morning of January 6, Trump speaks to a large crowd assembled near the White House, repeating his claims about the election and urging the crowd to march to the Capitol and make their voices heard. What happens next unfolds on live television, watched by the country and the world in real time. The crowd moving to the Capitol, barriers breached, police overwhelmed, the building entered by a mob that interrupts the certification process and sends members of Congress and the Vice President into secure locations while the Capitol is occupied for several hours. The images from January 6, the crowds in the halls of Congress, the broken windows, the Confederate flag carried through the rotunda, the specific and individually unforgettable scenes of disorder in a building that is among the most symbolically charged in American democracy, produce a reaction that is immediate and global in its shock. Trump is impeached for the second time, 10 days before his term ends, on a charge of incitement of insurrection, with 10 House Republicans joining all House Democrats in support of the article, the most bipartisan impeachment vote in American history. The Senate trial, conducted after Trump has left office, acquits him for the second time, with 7 Republican senators voting to convict, the most bipartisan impeachment conviction vote in American history, but still 14 short of the 2/3 majority required. On January 20, 2021, Joe Biden is inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States on the steps of the same Capitol that was breached 14 days before. Donald Trump does not attend, the first president in over a century to absent himself from his successor's inauguration. He departs Washington by helicopter and then by Air Force One, landing at Palm Beach and driving to Mar-a-Lago, where he has established his post-presidential residence. He is 74 years old. His presidency has lasted exactly 4 years. In those 4 years, he has passed the most significant tax legislation in a generation, reshaped the Supreme Court more fundamentally than any president since Franklin Roosevelt, renegotiated the country's trade relationships, brokered historic diplomatic agreements in the Middle East, launched the vaccine program that will eventually end the pandemic's most acute phase, been impeached twice, survived 2 Senate trials, and presided over the most contested electoral transition in modern American history. He has not, by any measure, been a conventional president. He has not governed by the norms and the protocols and the institutional expectations that define the conventional understanding of the office. He has been, from the first words of his inaugural address to the last hours of his term, entirely himself, the same person who descended the Trump Tower escalator in June of 2015, the same person who negotiated the Commodore Hotel tax abatement in the 1970s, the same person who was born on Flag Day in a hospital in Queens in 1946 and raised in a Georgian colonial mansion and shaped by a military academy on the Hudson River and educated at Wharton and forged by everything that came after. The question of what he is finally, what the 45th presidency means, what its legacy is, how history will account for it, is a question that the country is not yet equipped to answer and may not be for some years to come. The passions are too fresh, the wounds too recent, the arguments too live and too loud for the distance that honest historical assessment requires. What can be said with confidence is that it happened. That a man from Queens with no political experience and no military service and a business record that includes both extraordinary success and extraordinary failure won the presidency of the United States, governed it for 4 years in a manner entirely his own, and left behind a country that is, in almost every sense that matters, different from the country he inherited. Whether different means better or worse, is the argument that America is still having. And Donald Trump, at Mar-a-Lago, is listening to it. And he is not done. Chapter 9, The Exile and the Return, 2022 to 2024. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows great political departures. A silence that is never entirely silent, because the person who has departed is too large, too present, too deeply embedded in the argument the country is having with itself to simply recede into the ordinary quiet of private life. Some former presidents managed this transition with a grace that borders on disappearance. They build libraries, they paint landscapes, they give occasional speeches at comfortable fees, and attend their party's conventions as honored elders, and gradually, willingly, allow the volume of their public presence to diminish to something appropriate to their new station. They become history while they are still alive, and they seem for the most part to find this acceptable. Donald Trump does not find it acceptable. He has never found diminishment acceptable, in any form, in any context, at any stage of his life. And the diminishment implied by the title of former president, the suggestion that the story is over, that the chapter is closed, that the man who once commanded the most powerful office on earth is now a historical figure rather than a present force, is a diminishment he rejects with the same totality with which he has rejected every other adverse verdict that life has delivered. He is at Mar-a-Lago. He is not retired. He is not reflecting. He is not writing his memoirs in the contemplative spirit of a man who has made his peace with the past. He is, from the first days of his post-presidential residence in Palm Beach, doing what he has always done when the world has concluded that his moment has passed. He is proving the world wrong. The instrument of his continued political presence, in the immediate aftermath of January 2021, is the same instrument that served him throughout his presidency and throughout his campaign, the rally. He begins holding rallies in the spring and summer of 2021, drawing crowds that are, by the standards of a man who no longer holds office, and who has been banned from Twitter and Facebook in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, extraordinary in their size and their fervor. The people who come to these rallies are not coming out of nostalgia. They are not coming to say farewell to a political figure whose moment has passed. They are coming because they do not believe the moment has passed, because they share, in many cases with considerable intensity, Trump's own conviction that the 2020 election was not a legitimate conclusion but an interruption, a wrong that has not been righted, an outcome that does not reflect the genuine will of the country. The Republican Party of 2021 is a party in genuine internal conflict about its own future, about whether the Trump era represents a transformation that should be sustained and built upon, or a deviation that should be corrected and moved past. The conflict is real and it is significant, but its resolution, in the months following January 2021, becomes increasingly clear. The party's base, the voters who attend the rallies, who consume the conservative media that has aligned itself with Trump, who drive the primary elections that determine who gets to represent the party in general elections, that base is not interested in moving past Trump. It is interested in Trump. And in a political party whose elected officials must win primary elections to hold their offices, the preferences of the base are not a peripheral consideration. The Republican members of Congress who voted to impeach Trump after January 6th, all 10 of them in the House, discover this in their subsequent political careers with a thoroughness that serves as a cautionary lesson to their colleagues. Liz Cheney, the Wyoming congresswoman and daughter of the former vice president, who votes for impeachment and then accepts appointment as vice chair of the House Select Committee investigating January 6th, loses her primary election in August of 2022 by a margin of 37 percentage points. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois does not seek re-election. Others lose their primaries or decline to run. The message is delivered across the Republican caucus with the clarity of arithmetic. Opposition to Trump in a Republican primary is, in most districts and most states, a path to political termination. Trump announces his candidacy for the 2024 presidential election on November 15, 2022, 2 years before the election, and 1 week after the midterm elections in which the widely predicted Republican red wave fails to materialize, producing results that Republican strategists and donors and media figures use to make the case, with unusual openness, that Trump's influence on candidate selection has cost the party winnable races. The argument is real, and the evidence for it is not negligible. In Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Arizona, and Nevada, Republican candidates endorsed by Trump and aligned with his claims about the 2020 election underperform in ways that appear directly connected to those endorsements and those alignments. Trump announces anyway. The announcement is itself a statement, a refusal to accept the post-midterm narrative of diminishment, a declaration that the calendar of American politics will be organized again around his candidacy. He announces at Mar-a-Lago, in the gilded ballroom of the estate that has been his home and his court, and his political headquarters for the past 2 years, and the speech is, by the standards of his 2015 announcement, notably subdued. A performance of presidential gravity rather than populist combustion, as if he is arriving at the race not as an insurgent but as an incumbent seeking restoration. The legal battles that will define the following 2 years begin to fully materialize in the months surrounding the announcement. They arrive from multiple directions simultaneously, in a convergence of legal jeopardy that is, in its scale and its variety, without precedent in the history of American presidential politics. No former president has ever faced criminal indictment. Donald Trump faces 4 of them. In Manhattan, the district attorney's office under Alvin Bragg pursues a case centered on the payment of hush money to the adult film actress Stormy Daniels, Stephanie Clifford, in the weeks before the 2016 election, and the subsequent recording of that payment in the Trump Organization's books in a manner that prosecutors allege constitutes falsification of business records. The legal theory connecting these facts to felony charges, rather than the misdemeanor that business records falsification typically constitutes, involves the allegation that the records were falsified in furtherance of another crime, a violation of campaign finance law through the undisclosed payment to Daniels. The Manhattan case produces, in March of 2023, the first criminal indictment of a former president in American history. Trump is indicted on 34 counts of falsifying business records. He surrenders to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, is photographed and fingerprinted in the standard processing of a criminal defendant, and appears before a judge to enter a plea of not guilty. The images of this process, a former president of the United States being processed as a criminal defendant, are among the most extraordinary in the visual record of American political life. Trump's response to the indictment is entirely characteristic. He does not retreat. He does not moderate. He transforms the legal proceeding into a political event, using the indictment as evidence for the argument he has been making about the country's governing institutions, that they have been weaponized against him by political opponents who cannot defeat him at the ballot box and are therefore attempting to remove him from politics through the legal system. He raises tens of millions of dollars in small donations in the days following the indictment, the fundraising appeals arriving in inboxes within hours of the news, converting legal jeopardy into financial fuel with a speed that demonstrates the organizational infrastructure his political operation has built. The federal indictments follow in the summer of 2023. Special counsel Jack Smith, appointed by Attorney General Merrick Garland to investigate Trump's handling of classified documents and his conduct surrounding the January 6 attack on the Capitol, brings 2 separate sets of charges. The classified documents case, filed in federal court in Miami, charges Trump with retaining classified national security documents at Mar-a-Lago after leaving office, obstructing the government's efforts to retrieve them, and making false statements about their existence. The evidence includes surveillance footage from Mar-a-Lago, showing boxes being moved in ways that prosecutors allege are consistent with concealment, and testimony from Trump's own employees about conversations and instructions regarding the documents. The January 6 case, filed in federal court in Washington, charges Trump with conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights, charges arising from his efforts in the weeks between the November 2020 election and January 6, 2021, to overturn the election results through a variety of means, including pressure on state officials to find votes, pressure on the Justice Department to declare the election corrupt, pressure on Vice President Pence to refuse certification of the Electoral College results, and the events of January 6 itself. In Georgia, the Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis brings a racketeering indictment against Trump and 18 co-defendants under the Georgia RICO statute, the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations law, typically associated with organized crime prosecutions, applied here to the alleged coordinated effort to overturn Georgia's 2020 election results. The Georgia indictment is the broadest and most legally ambitious of the 4 cases, encompassing conduct ranging from the phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump asks Raffensperger to find him the votes needed to reverse his Georgia deficit, to the submission of a slate of fake electors, to the breach of voting equipment in rural Coffee County by individuals allegedly connected to the effort. The accumulation of 4 criminal indictments, across 2 federal and 2 state jurisdictions, covering conduct spanning several years and involving dozens of alleged co-conspirators, creates a legal situation of extraordinary complexity, one that requires coordination among multiple sets of defense attorneys, that generates an ongoing flow of court filings and judicial rulings and procedural developments that requires daily attention from a legal team of considerable size, and that exists simultaneously with an active presidential campaign, for which Trump is raising money, attending rallies, preparing for debates, and managing the full operational complexity of a major political organization. The simultaneity is not accidental. Trump's legal and political strategies are, from the beginning, deeply integrated. The legal proceedings are managed not merely as legal proceedings, but as political events, with each court appearance, each filing, each ruling communicated to the base through fundraising appeals and social media posts and public statements that frame the legal situation in terms that reinforce the central political narrative, that this is persecution, that the charges are politically motivated, that the institutions pursuing them are the same corrupt institutions that stole the 2020 election, and that a vote for Trump in 2024 is a vote against the system that is trying to destroy him. The political potency of this framing is not simply a matter of partisan loyalty or tribal psychology, though both of those forces are present and significant. It connects to something broader and more durable in the American political atmosphere of 2023 and 2024, a widespread skepticism about institutions, a declining confidence in the fairness and the impartiality of the legal and governmental systems, a sense among a significant portion of the electorate that the rules are applied differently to different people depending on their politics and their enemies. Whether or not this skepticism is justified in any specific case is a separate question from whether it is widely felt, and it is widely felt. And Trump speaks to it with the authority of someone who is, quite literally, the subject of the institutional action he is describing. The Republican primary of 2024 unfolds against this backdrop. The indictments, the fundraising records set in their wake, the polling that shows Trump's support within the Republican electorate, holding and then growing as the charges accumulate. His opponents in the primary, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, the entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, former Vice President Mike Pence, and others, must navigate the extraordinary challenge of running against a candidate whose legal jeopardy is simultaneously his greatest political vulnerability and, within the Republican primary electorate, his greatest political asset. DeSantis, who enters the race as the candidate most frequently identified as a potential Trump successor, conservative enough to appeal to the base, institutionally credible enough to appeal to the donors, and the establishment figures who want a Trump without Trump, discovers that the concept of Trump without Trump has little appeal to the voters who want Trump. His campaign, launched with considerable fanfare and considerable fundraising in May of 2023, never achieves the ignition its supporters anticipate, and he withdraws before the Iowa caucuses in January of 2024, endorsing Trump with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has spent 8 months learning a lesson about the Republican Party that he should perhaps have absorbed earlier. Nikki Haley remains in the race longest and most credibly, winning sufficient support in New Hampshire and other states to establish herself as the sole remaining serious alternative, and making arguments about Trump's fitness and electability that are, by the standards of Republican primary politics, unusually direct. She wins the Republican primary in the District of Columbia and performs respectably in a number of states. But she does not come close to winning the nomination, and she withdraws in March of 2024, endorsing Trump and completing the consolidation of the Republican field around the man who has dominated it from the first day of its existence. Trump clinches the Republican nomination in March of 2024, earlier in the calendar than any non-incumbent in the modern primary era, and turns his attention to the general election in circumstances that are, at first, defined by the opponent he has been expecting. Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee, seeking a second term, and the contest between the two men who faced each other in 2020, the rematch that both parties' primary electorates have, through their voting behavior, selected, is the organizing assumption of the political landscape through the spring and into the summer of 2024. And then, in July, everything changes. Biden's debate performance against Trump on June 27, 2024, is a television event of enormous consequence, a 90-minute encounter in which the incumbent president's halting delivery, his moments of apparent confusion, his difficulty completing thoughts with the fluency that the occasion demands, raises questions about his cognitive fitness that had been circulating in quieter forms for months, and that the debate broadcasts to an audience of tens of millions in a manner that cannot be explained away or contextualized into irrelevance. The Democratic Party, confronting the evidence of what the country has seen, enters a period of intense internal debate about the path forward. Biden withdraws from the race on July 21, 2024, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris as his successor. Harris secures the Democratic nomination in a process without precedent in modern American politics, a compressed, convention-adjacent selection that bypasses the primary process entirely and produces a nominee who has not competed in a single primary contest. She enters the general election with significant structural advantages: the financial resources of the Biden campaign, the institutional support of the Democratic Party, the enthusiasm generated by her historic candidacy as a woman of Black and South Asian heritage, and with a significant structural challenge: the compressed timeline, the absence of a primary victory to confer Democratic legitimacy on her candidacy in the traditional sense, and the difficulty of simultaneously running as change and as continuity in an electorate that is, by every measure, dissatisfied with the direction of the country. The general election campaign of 2024 is, by the standards of American political history, brief and intense, less than 4 months between Harris' entry and Election Day. 4 months in which the candidates crisscross the battleground states of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada with the frantic energy of a compressed timeline. Trump holds his rallies, still enormous, still fervent, still organized around the themes of trade and immigration, and the failures of the governing class that he has been articulating since 2015. Harris holds her events, drawing crowds of her own that are, in the assessments of her campaign, evidence of an enthusiasm that the polling may not fully be capturing. The assassination attempt on Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, on July 13, 2024, produces one of the most extraordinary images in the history of American presidential politics. A gunman opens fire at a Trump rally, and a bullet grazes Trump's right ear. In the immediate aftermath, in the seconds between the shots and the Secret Service agents reaching the stage, Trump raises his fist to the crowd, blood visible on his face, in a gesture that is simultaneously spontaneous and perfectly symbolic, the gesture of a man who has been shot at, and whose first instinct is to show the crowd that he is not defeated. The image is photographed and published around the world, and becomes instantly one of the defining images of the political year, a visual argument, more powerful than any speech or any advertisement, for the narrative of resilience and defiance that has always been at the center of Trump's political identity. He is back on his feet within days, appearing at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee in the week following the attempt, the bandage on his ear visible and unremarked upon, delivering an acceptance speech that is, by the unusual standards of his convention speeches, notably long and notably reflective, including passages about the attempted assassination that carry a quality of genuine gravity, of a man who has looked at something very close and very dark and emerged from the proximity with a perspective he did not previously possess. The vice presidential selection, J.D. Vance, the Ohio senator and author of Hillbilly Elegy, a man who traveled from sharp Trump critic to ardent Trump supporter across the years of Trump's political dominance, and who represents, in his personal biography and his political evolution, the story of working-class dislocation and cultural alienation that Trump has always claimed to represent, completes the Republican ticket with a choice that is both ideologically coherent and generationally deliberate, a 39-year-old who will be positioned, whatever happens in 2024, as the future of the political movement Trump has built. Election night, November 5, 2024, does not produce the prolonged uncertainty of 2020, the days of counting and the competing claims and the legal challenges filed in multiple states. It produces, instead, a result that arrives with relative clarity and considerable speed, a result that is, in its electoral geography and its popular vote dimensions, a more decisive Trump victory than 2016. He wins Pennsylvania. He wins Michigan. He wins Wisconsin. He wins Georgia. He wins the Sun Belt battlegrounds. He wins for the first time for a Republican presidential candidate in 2 decades, the popular vote, a margin narrow enough to be subject to continued counting, but real enough to be a genuine historical milestone. A Republican candidate winning more votes than his Democratic opponent in a national election for the first time since George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. He wins, in short, a second term. A non-consecutive second term, only the second in American history, the first since Grover Cleveland served his second presidency beginning in 1893, achieved against the backdrop of 4 criminal indictments, a conviction in the Manhattan case, the most intense and sustained legal and institutional opposition any American political figure has faced in the modern era, and the judgment of a substantial portion of the country's credentialed and institutional class that his return to power would constitute a genuine threat to the republic. The people who cast their votes for him on November 5, 2024, do not share this assessment, or do not share it with sufficient force to override the other considerations: the economy, the border, the sense of a country whose direction has not been right, the specific and personal feeling that their concerns and their lives have not been taken seriously by the people who have been running things. They vote for him in numbers sufficient to return him to the office from which he departed, in contested circumstances, 4 years before. The legal cases, which seemed in 2023 to represent an existential threat to his candidacy, have largely stalled by the time the election arrives. The federal cases caught in procedural disputes, the Supreme Court's ruling in July of 2024 on presidential immunity significantly narrowing the scope of the January 6 prosecution, the Georgia case entangled in disqualification proceedings against the district attorney, the Manhattan conviction producing a sentence that, after considerable legal maneuvering, results in an unconditional discharge. The legal system that his opponents believed would stop him has not stopped him. The ballot box, which his opponents believed would stop him, has not stopped him. He has not been stopped. On the evening of November 5, 2024, standing before a crowd of supporters in West Palm Beach, Donald Trump delivers a victory speech that carries, beneath its familiar cadences of grievance and triumph, something that his previous victory speeches have not quite contained: the weight of a man who understands, with a specificity available only to someone who has actually held the office, what he is returning to. He knows the Oval Office. He knows the Situation Room. He knows the specific gravity of the decisions that will arrive, daily and relentlessly, on the desk of the most powerful person in the world. He has been there, and he is going back, and the going back carries a quality of intentionality, of premeditation that his first arrival could not possess. He is 78 years old. He has been bankrupt, and he has been rebuilt. He has been celebrated, and he has been indicted. He has governed, and he has been defeated, and he has refused the defeat, and he has returned. He is, by any honest accounting, one of the most improbable and most consequential figures in the history of American political life. A man whose story contains more reversals and more comebacks, and more moments of apparent finality that turn out not to be final than any story the Republic has produced since its founding. The exile is over. The return is complete. And what comes next? The second presidency, the final chapter, the culmination of a life lived at the absolute edge of American ambition, is the story that history is only beginning to record. He has always known how to make an entrance. And the door, once again, is open. Chapter 10. The 47th Presidency and the 250th Anniversary, 2025-2026. The 20th of January 2025 arrives in Washington with a cold so severe that the inauguration ceremony is moved indoors, to the Capitol Rotunda, a decision that produces, by accident or by design, an intimacy of setting entirely unlike the vast outdoor pageants of previous inaugurations, and that gives the proceedings the quality of something witnessed rather than merely attended. The rotunda's painted ceiling, the statues of the Republic's founders arranged in their permanent vigil around the circular walls, the dome above channeling the pale January light, it is, as settings go, one of the most charged in American civic life, and Donald Trump, standing at its center for the second time as president, inhabits it with the ease of someone returning to a place he has thought about continuously in the years of his absence. He is 78 years old. He is, by the actuarial tables, and by the evidence visible to anyone observing him, a man whose physical energy, while not what it was at 50 or 60, remains formidable by the standards of a man his age. The same restlessness, the same intensity of focus when focus is required, the same capacity to dominate a room simply by being present in it. He has lived, in the 4 years since his first departure from Washington, through a sequence of events that would have broken most people: the indictments, the trial, the conviction, the appeals, the assassination attempt, the campaign. And he has arrived at this second inauguration, carrying all of it, visibly and invisibly, in the particular way that a man carries the full weight of an extraordinary life. The speech he delivers in the Rotunda is different from the speech he delivered on the Capitol steps 8 years before. It is not the speech of an insurgent. It is the speech of a man who has been tested, by the office itself in his first term and by everything that followed, and who understands with the specificity of direct experience what the country is and what it requires. There are familiar themes: the restoration of American greatness, the failures of the governing class, the promise of an administration that will put the interests of ordinary Americans ahead of the interests of the entrenched and the comfortable. But there is something else beneath these themes: a gravity, a deliberateness, a sense of an agenda that has been refined in the years of exile into something more focused and more specific than the broad impulses of 2017. He knows this time how Washington works. He knows its resistances and its rhythms, its capacity to absorb and to dilute, the ways in which the machinery of the federal government can slow or redirect or simply outlast the intentions of any single administration. He knows the appointments that matter and the ones that are decorative. He knows the executive orders that will stick and the ones that will be immediately challenged in the courts of the Ninth Circuit. He knows, in short, what he is walking into, and this time he is prepared for it with a thoroughness that his first administration, launched in the genuine improvisation of an outsider who had never governed, could not match. The preparation has a name, or rather it has a structure, and the structure is one of the most discussed and most contested governance initiatives in the early months of the new administration: the Department of Government Efficiency. The name is itself a provocation, not a department in the formal cabinet sense, since creating a new cabinet department requires an act of Congress that this administration does not intend to seek, but an advisory body with an unusual mandate and an unusual set of principles. Elon Musk, the South African-born entrepreneur whose companies include Tesla and SpaceX, and who acquired Twitter, rebranded as X, in 2022, is named as its co-leader alongside Vivek Ramaswamy, the entrepreneur who ran briefly for the Republican presidential nomination before endorsing Trump and becoming one of the administration's most prominent surrogates. Together, they constitute, in the imagination of the administration's supporters, a kind of private sector cavalry arriving to rescue the federal government from the accumulated inefficiencies of decades of bureaucratic expansion. The acronym is, of course, deliberate. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, shares its name with a cryptocurrency that Musk has promoted intermittently, and that has become, in the internet culture that Musk both inhabits and shapes, a symbol of a particular kind of anti-establishment irreverence. The naming is a signal, directed at a specific audience, that this administration intends to approach the machinery of the federal government with the same disruptive energy that Silicon Valley has applied to the industries it has transformed. It is also, less charitably read, a branding exercise in the Trump tradition, the attachment of a memorable name to an initiative in ways that ensure its presence in the cultural conversation regardless of its substantive outcomes. The substantive ambitions of DOGE are, in their full articulation, genuinely sweeping. Musk speaks publicly and repeatedly of identifying and eliminating trillions of dollars in federal waste, a number that most budget analysts regard as implausibly large, given that the entire discretionary budget of the federal government is roughly $2 trillion annually, and that most federal spending is either legally mandated or politically impossible to cut without a congressional coalition that does not currently exist. The gap between the stated ambition and the mathematical reality is noted in the press coverage of DOGE's early months with varying degrees of charity. What DOGE actually produces in its operational phase is a review of federal agency spending and staffing of a thoroughness and an aggression that the federal bureaucracy has not experienced in any previous administration. Teams of young analysts, many of them recruited from Musk's own companies, many of them without prior government experience, arrive at federal agencies with access to financial systems and personnel records, and proceed to identify, with the speed of people who are not weighted down by institutional knowledge or institutional loyalty, expenditures and positions and contracts that they deem inefficient, unnecessary, or duplicative. The results are, depending on who is evaluating them, either a long overdue reckoning with a bloated bureaucracy or a reckless assault on the institutional capacity of the federal government conducted by people who do not understand what the institutions they are dismantling actually do. Federal employees receive notices of termination or voluntary separation at a scale not seen since the post-World War II demobilization. Agencies find their budgets frozen, their contracts canceled, their operations disrupted in ways that produce immediate legal challenges from employee unions and from Democratic state attorneys general who argue that the terminations violate civil service law and that the budget impoundments violate the constitutional prerogatives of Congress. The legal challenges produce injunctions. The injunctions are appealed. The appeals produce a series of rulings that define, with varying degrees of precision, the boundaries of executive authority over federal employment and federal spending, rulings that will, in their totality, constitute a significant body of administrative law, whatever their immediate practical effect. The courts that issue the injunctions are, in some cases, the same courts that issued injunctions against the first Trump administration's immigration orders, and the administration's response, public criticism of the judges, appeals filed within hours, public pressure on the judiciary through social media, and through the president's own statements, follows the familiar pattern of a White House that regards judicial resistance as a political opportunity as much as a legal obstacle. The net savings that DOJ claims by the end of its first year are disputed at every step of the accounting, disputed in their calculation, disputed in their attribution, disputed by the agencies whose budgets have been cut as to whether the claimed eliminations represent genuine waste or genuine capacity. Independent analysts produce assessments ranging from modestly positive to sharply critical. The political reality is that DOJ has become, regardless of its fiscal impact, a symbol for the administration's supporters, of a government finally being held accountable by people who answer to results rather than to process, and a symbol for its critics of ideological vandalism conducted by billionaires who have mistaken the power to disrupt for the wisdom to improve. Ramaswamy departs the co-leadership of DOJ in the early months of 2025, returning to private pursuits that include a gubernatorial campaign in Ohio. His exit handled with the mutual expressions of appreciation that Washington departures typically generate, whatever the private circumstances, and leaving Musk as the initiative's primary public face. Musk's own relationship with the administration, conducted at a level of public visibility unusual for a presidential advisor, generates its own continuing narrative. The appearances at White House events, the social media commentary on administration policy, the occasional public disagreements with other administration officials that are resolved or not resolved, in ways that reveal the particular dynamics of an advisory relationship between two men who are both accustomed to being the dominant personality in any room they enter. The domestic policy agenda of the second term extends far beyond DOJ, encompassing immigration enforcement at a scale and with a legal framework that the first term aspired to but could not fully achieve, trade policy that extends and deepens the tariff architecture of the first term, energy policy that aggressively expands domestic fossil fuel production while rolling back the regulatory framework that the Biden administration built around renewable energy transition, and a series of executive actions on social policy, on the recognition of gender, on diversity programs in federal contracting and employment, on the teaching of certain historical frameworks in federally funded institutions, that produce the predictable legal challenges and the predictable cultural conflicts and the predictable fundraising appeals on both sides. But it is in foreign policy that the second term produces its most consequential and most dramatic development, the event that will, in the historical accounting of this presidency, likely stand as its defining moment, the thing that everything before it was, in some sense, a preparation for, and that everything after it will be understood in the context of. The Iran crisis of 2025 has roots that extend deep into the preceding decade. into the nuclear negotiations that produced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, into Trump's withdrawal from that agreement in 2018, and the reimposition of sanctions that followed, into the Iranian nuclear program's subsequent acceleration, into the intelligence assessments that by 2024 indicate with high confidence that Iran is within weeks rather than months of producing a nuclear weapon, if it chooses to do so. The crisis is not a surprise to anyone who has been following the trajectory of Iranian nuclear development. It is, rather, the arrival of a threshold that has been visible for years, the moment when the question that administrations of both parties have been managing and deferring becomes a question that can no longer be managed or deferred. The decision point arrives in the spring of 2025, with a sequence of intelligence developments that the administration judges to require a response. Specific evidence of weaponization activities at undisclosed facilities that suggest Iran has moved beyond the enrichment phase and into the actual construction of a device. The National Security Council convenes. The options are presented. The range runs from continued sanctions pressure to targeted strikes on specific facilities to a more comprehensive military campaign. The Allies are consulted with varying degrees of enthusiasm for American military action. Israel firmly supportive, the Gulf states cautiously supportive, the European allies urging restraint and diplomacy, Russia and China loudly opposed. Trump makes the decision with the directness that has characterized his approach to consequential choices throughout his public life. Not after a period of extended deliberation conducted in the manner of a president who wants the deliberation itself to be part of the record, but after satisfying himself that the intelligence is solid, that the military options are achievable, and that the cost of inaction, measured in the proliferation consequences of a nuclear-armed Iran, and the signal it sends to every other state considering a nuclear program, exceeds the cost of action. The strikes begin in a coordinated operation that involves American air assets and naval assets operating from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, supported by intelligence and logistics that reflect the full weight of American military capability brought to bear on a specific and defined set of targets: the enrichment facilities, the weaponization sites, the command and control infrastructure of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps elements most directly involved in the nuclear program. Israel conducts simultaneous operations against Iranian air defenses and against Hezbollah positions in Lebanon that might otherwise be used to retaliate against Israeli territory. The military operation achieves its primary objectives: the destruction of the identified nuclear facilities, with a precision and a speed that reflects the planning that has, it becomes clear, been underway for considerably longer than the immediate crisis. The Iranian response is fierce and multidimensional. Missile salvos against American bases in the region, proxy attacks through Hezbollah and the Houthi movement and Iraqi Shia militias, a naval confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz that briefly disrupts global oil shipping and sends energy prices sharply higher. American servicemen and women are killed in the retaliatory strikes, a fact that Trump acknowledges publicly and personally, in the manner of a commander-in-chief who understands that the cost of the decision he has made is not abstract, but is measured in specific human lives and specific family grief. The military confrontation, too brief and too targeted to constitute a war in the conventional sense, but too consequential and too deadly to be described as anything less, produces a global reaction of enormous intensity. Allied governments express varying degrees of support, concern, and alarm. The United Nations Security Council convenes in emergency session. The oil markets spike and then gradually recede as the immediate military phase concludes and the strait reopens. The Iranian government, its nuclear program set back by an estimated several years according to intelligence assessments released in the aftermath, enters a period of internal political turbulence, the consequences of a military humiliation that is simultaneously a domestic political crisis. In the United States, the reaction follows the familiar geography of American political division, with a clarity and an intensity sharpened by the stakes. The administration's supporters regard the strikes as the fulfillment of a long-deferred obligation, the necessary confrontation with an Iranian nuclear program that previous administrations of both parties allowed to advance through a combination of diplomacy that Iran used as cover and deterrence that Iran tested and found conditional. The administration's critics regard the strikes as a dangerous escalation, a unilateral military action undertaken without adequate diplomatic exhaustion, a conflict whose long-term consequences in regional stability and American strategic position have not been adequately weighed. The congressional debate, the questions about authorization, about the War Powers Resolution, about the proper role of the legislative branch in decisions of this magnitude, is fierce and in its resolution, inconclusive in the manner of war powers debates for the past half-century. History's verdict on the Iran operation will be rendered over years and decades rather than months, as the consequences for Iranian politics and Iranian nuclear ambitions and regional stability and American strategic credibility accumulate and reveal themselves. What can be said in its immediate aftermath is that it happened, that it was consequential, and that it was entirely consistent with a presidency that has never been interested in the management of problems but only in their resolution, even when, and perhaps especially when, the resolution is costly and contested and does not come with a guarantee of clean outcomes. Against this backdrop of policy drama and military consequence, the calendar of American history is moving toward a date that the country has been anticipating with a mixture of pride and solemnity, and the particular American talent for transforming historical occasions into celebrations of national identity. On June 14, 2025, Donald Trump's 79th birthday, the United States Army turns 250 years old. The Army was founded on June 14, 1775, by an act of the Second Continental Congress, 2 weeks before the Battle of Bunker Hill, and a full year before the Declaration of Independence. It predates the republic it defends. It is, in the timeline of American institutions, the oldest of the great federal organizations, created in the fire of revolution and sustained through every subsequent test of national life: the Civil War, the two World Wars, Korea and Vietnam, and the Gulf and Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the smaller and less named conflicts that punctuate the American military story across 2.5 centuries. The 250th anniversary parade that Trump organizes, that he has been, by all accounts, deeply personally invested in organizing, his enthusiasm for military pageantry, a consistent feature of his character across both terms, is staged in Washington with a scale and a deliberateness that makes clear it is not merely a birthday party for an institution, but a statement about the country and about the presidency. Pennsylvania Avenue, the great ceremonial corridor of the Capitol, becomes the stage for a procession of military hardware and military personnel that is, in its ambition, the most comprehensive display of American military might on American soil since the Victory Parade following the Gulf War in 1991. The tanks, Abrams main battle tanks, their armor gleaming in the June sun, roll down Pennsylvania Avenue with a weight and a rumble that is felt as much as heard, the vibration moving through the pavement and through the bodies of the hundreds of thousands of spectators who line the route. The aircraft fly in precise formation overhead, the fighters and the bombers and the transport aircraft, and in a moment that the crowd receives with particular intensity, the distinctive silhouette of Air Force One making a low pass above them all. The soldiers march in the dress uniforms of every branch and every era, carrying the flags of units whose lineages extend to the Revolutionary War itself. Trump watches from a reviewing stand on the avenue, and the watching has the quality of genuine pleasure. A man who has always loved the visual and the theatrical and the monumental, who has spent his life building things designed to command attention, in the presence of the largest and most capable military force the world has ever produced, arrayed in its full ceremonial power on the streets of the city he governs. He is the commander-in-chief of what passes before him. On his birthday. On the Army's birthday. In the nation's capital. In the 250th year of the Republic's existence. The symbolism is so dense that it almost collapses under its own weight, and Trump, who has always understood symbolism as a form of architecture, as something that is built deliberately, stone by stone, image by image, with an intention that the audience may not consciously recognize but will feel, allows it to accumulate without visible self-consciousness. He waves. He salutes. He stands with the posture of someone who understands exactly where he is in the frame. The nation's semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of American independence, falling on July 4, 2026, is the larger civic occasion that the Army's birthday parade anticipates and previews. The administration's planning for the semi-quincentennial celebration is, in its scope and its ambition, consistent with a president who has always believed that America's greatness should be made visible, that the country's achievements should be celebrated with the fullness they deserve, rather than qualified by the fashionable ambivalence of an elite that has, in Trump's telling, spent too many years apologizing for a country it should be celebrating. The July 4, 2026 celebrations across the country are, by every measure, extraordinary. The fireworks and the concerts and the ceremonies and the presidential address from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The full apparatus of American civic celebration deployed at its maximum scale in acknowledgement of a milestone that comes only once in the nation's history. Trump speaks to the country from the memorial with the particular authority of a man who has governed it and who has returned to govern it again, who has seen its machinery from the inside and who carries in his own biography a version of the American story, unlikely, contested, improbable, resilient, that is not without its own resonance in the context of 250 years of a republic that has survived everything its own contradictions and its own enemies have thrown at it. But the celebration is shadowed, and then interrupted, by an event that no planning can anticipate, and no security apparatus, however comprehensive, can entirely prevent. During the White House Correspondents' Association dinner of 2026, the same annual ritual that 15 years before was the occasion of Trump's public humiliation at the hands of Barack Obama and Seth Meyers, the evening that sat in his memory as a wound and a motivation through all the years of his political ascent, a security incident occurs that will be immediately described in the breathless vocabulary of breaking news as an assassination attempt. The details, as they emerge across the hours and days following the incident, are precise in some respects and contested in others, as the details of all such events are in their immediate aftermath. A threat is identified in the vicinity of the event. The Secret Service responds with the protocols that have been updated and reinforced following the Butler, Pennsylvania, shooting of July 2024, reinforced with a thoroughness that reflects the institutional reckoning of an agency that knows, with the specificity of documented failure, what happens when those protocols are insufficient. The president is moved. The threat is neutralized. The dinner proceeds in a form, though with the quality of an event that has been fundamentally altered by what has occurred in its margins. Trump's public response to the incident is, characteristically, defiant. Not the defiance of bravado performed for an audience, but the defiance of a man who has, by this point in his life, been shot at once, tried 4 times, convicted once, and returned to the presidency nonetheless, and for whom the category of threats to his continuation has been so thoroughly populated that a new entry, however serious, does not produce in him the response that it might produce in a person with a shorter experience of adversity. He is seen publicly within hours of the incident. He posts on social media. He does not cancel his schedule. He continues. The WHCA dinner itself, the institution that once hosted his humiliation, that he once boycotted in his first term, that he has returned to in his second term with the confidence of a man who no longer needs to avoid the rooms where he was once mocked, becomes, in the context of the security incident that surrounds it, something more than its usual self. It becomes a moment in the ongoing story of a presidency that seems, by the accumulated evidence of its protagonist's biography, constitutionally incapable of the ordinary. The second term, as it moves through its first year and into its second, is a presidency in active motion, generating policy, generating controversy, generating the particular kind of constant news cycle that Donald Trump has always produced, and that his supporters have always regarded as evidence of consequential action and his critics have always regarded as evidence of dangerous instability. The economy responds to the tariff architecture with the complexity that economists predicted. Some sectors strengthened by protection from foreign competition, other sectors burdened by the higher costs of imported inputs. The net effect a matter of genuine dispute among people who are looking at the same data from different angles. The immigration enforcement measures produce a decline in illegal border crossings that the administration promotes as a central achievement, and a set of human stories involving families and communities, and the specific texture of lives disrupted that the administration's critics assemble as a counter-narrative. The Supreme Court, reshaped by the 3 appointments of the first term, continues to issue decisions that reflect the transformation of the judiciary that will be, in the long view of history, among the most enduring legacies of the Trump political era. Cases involving the administrative state, the scope of executive authority, the limits of regulatory power, the great constitutional questions of the 21st century, are decided in ways that systematically narrow the power of the federal bureaucracy and expand the authority of the elected branches, producing a rebalancing of governmental power that the conservative legal movement has been working toward for decades and that Trump's appointments have delivered. And through all of it, the Doge battles and the Iran strikes and the parade and the anniversary and the security incidents, and the ongoing production of an administration that never stops being news, the man at the center remains remarkably and perhaps uniquely himself. The same instincts, the same appetites, the same refusal of diminishment in any form. The same absolute conviction that the story is not over, that the next chapter is the most important one, that the work of making America great, a phrase he has been saying for a decade now, that has become so familiar it sometimes loses its specificity, is work that is never finished, that each day brings new tests and new opportunities and new moments in which the right decision, made with sufficient courage, can change the trajectory of the largest and most consequential democratic experiment in human history. He stands, in the summer of 2026, at the intersection of his own remarkable story and the nation's remarkable anniversary. A man who began in Queens and arrived at the apex of American power not once but twice, who was broken and rebuilt again, who has been everything the Republic can produce by way of controversy and consequence, and who has, through all of it, remained the most American of figures, ambitious beyond reason, resilient beyond expectation, and convinced, with a faith that evidence has repeatedly tested and never permanently shaken, that the best is always still ahead. 250 years of America. 79 years of Donald Trump. The stories are not the same story, but they rhyme, in the way that the most enduring American stories always rhyme, with the particular music of a country that has always believed, against all evidence and because of all evidence, that the next chapter will be the greatest one yet. The parade is over. The fireworks have faded. The anniversary has been marked, with the fullness and the complexity it deserves. And in the Oval Office, in the building that was built by enslaved labor, and has housed the full range of human greatness and human failure that the American presidency has produced across 2.5 centuries, the 47th President of the United States sits at the resolute desk, and the inbox is full, and the phone is ringing, and the world is waiting. He picks up the phone. He has always picked up the phone. You have just finished listening to Sovereign Ambition, The Life and Two Presidencies of Donald J. Trump. This concludes our chronological journey through the 8-decade arc of a life that defined the New York skyline, dominated the global media landscape, and fundamentally redirected the course of American governance. From the foundations of a family dynasty in Queens to the unprecedented restoration of the 47th presidency, we have explored the high-stakes deals, the cultural revolutions, and the political resilience that characterized the Trump era. As the United States moves forward into the milestone celebrations of its 250th anniversary, the legacy of the architect of the future remains a central force in the ongoing story of the Republic. Thank you for listening.